This is the burden of devotion. In his wisdom, the Emperor brought an end to the folly of religion, the poison of fanaticism that had plagued terror, and plunged it into old night. He imposed reason and the imperial truth on all his subject realms, all but one. On Mars, the ancient curse lingered, hidden in the Byzantine rituals and obtuse traditions of the Mechanicum it endured, and deep in the bowels of the vast factory cities of the Red Planet, it festered and grew strong on old grudges and mistrust. Here Horus would find it, nurture it, and in the darkness forge it into a tool by which he might one day unlock the mightiest fortress in the galaxy. Devotion to the ancient creed of Mars, to the blood-soaked past instead of the Emperor's golden future, would blind so many of the lords of the Mechanicum. They could not abide that their cult might fall into the abyss of history and be forgotten, to be replaced by a new order. Yearning for those days when their forebears had reigned supreme amid a galaxy rent by war, many swore themselves to the Warmaster, and cared not for the price that must be paid for their blind zeal. Once more, mankind would sit at the mercy of the fanatic, of those who would see the galaxy burnt, rather than leave the past behind. Even as the embers of the Great Crusade cooled on the bloody plains of Estevan V, Mars would rise to war. Not to throw down the tyrant emperor, nor to enthrone the upstart Warmaster, but to rend and tear at its own soul. The children of the Red Planet fought either to free it from the chains of reason, or to throw off once and for all the cloak of mysticism, caring not at all for those who might rule the Imperium when the guns fell silent. So blinded were they by their devotion to the cause that they saw not the chink that had opened in Terra's once impenetrable armor. I will tell you of the deeds that were done, for you know not the truth of those dark years. I will not lie, and tell you that all we did was right and proper, for we both know that it was not. Is it what had to be done? I present to you this record, and ask you to decide, to pass judgment on those of us that lived through those terrible days. This is the burden of the Horus Heresy. The Death of Innocence. 005, Millennium 31. It began with silence. A terrible and damning silence that blanketed the Red Planet and isolated it entirely from the solar system, leaving the Imperium with little clue as to the horrors unfolding upon its surface. Beneath this veil, those amongst the Mechanicum sworn to the Fabricator General, and through him to Horus, undertook a great and bloody purge. All those that would not bend the knee to the Warmaster, be they high Magos or lowly Tech Adept, were broken. Some slain out of hand by the assassin's blade, others brought low by their own corrupted servants. Only a handful escaped Fabricator General Kelbor Hull's calculated wrath, those amongst the Tech Magi whose servants remained loyal and whose power was sufficient to hold any assault at bay. The shroud of corrupted scrap code that Kelbor Hull had unleashed hid his treachery for a time, its tendrils stretching out across the network of Mechanicum outposts in the solar system. But this could not last. Frantic Vox signals from Venus were the first alarm, marking the death of the climate control stations in the upper atmosphere of that world. These isolated outposts of the Mechanicum fell from the sky, while the tech priests within rent at each other in schismatic fury. This disaster was followed by a flurry of distress calls from across Sol as the adepts of Mars turned against one another with a sudden and unexpected fury. The scrap code reached to the furthest extremes of the system, where the frozen defense stations seeded amongst the Kuiper belt fought their own brief civil war with particle beams and servitor-guided missiles. At the center of this web of disaster sat the silent red orb of Mars. Ever pragmatic, Rogal Dorn, the Seneschal of Terror, ordered the destruction of all data links with the Red Planet. Units of black-clad Imperial Fist destroyers razed the data hubs and slew the tech priests inside, terminating all attempts by the scrap code to infiltrate the Imperial Palace at a terrible cost in lives. Word had reached him that, even as chaos gripped the Sol system, Horus had raised the flags of rebellion at distant Istvan, and he could only assume that Mars had fallen to the same madness, and must be meted the same measure of the Emperor's wrath. With the bulk of all the remaining loyal legions that could be assembled committed to the Istvan Censure fleet, Dorn had little remaining to send to Mars. In total, all that could be spared were 4 companies of his own Imperial Fists, the only warriors who could trust implicitly in the face of his brother's treachery, along with support troops of the Solar Auxilia. The final addition to the force were 36 of the Emperor's own guard, the Legio Custodes. These warriors were bound by Malcador of the Imperial Court to bear witness to whatever fate had befallen the home of the Mechanicum, and to act as a symbol to both loyal servant and rebel alike of the Emperor's authority. At the head of this strike force, Dorn placed 2 of his most trusted commanders, First Captain Sigismund and the veteran warrior Camba Diaz. Renowned even amongst the stoic Imperial Fists as a warrior of few words and measured action, Camba Diaz will serve to temper the infamous choler of Sigismund, who bore the warrant of command in Dorn's name. Their orders were simple: take their warriors and secure key production sites on Mars. Once a beachhead was secured, they were to assess the situation and, if practical, press the attack and retake the planet. The domain of war. No ships would rise from Mars's orbit to bar the passage of the task force as it approached, for all that remained above the Red Planet was broken wreckage. The Ring of Iron, the vast halo shipyard that encircled Mars like a belt, was in ruins, and many of its sections enveloped in flickering phosphex flame that burned even in the void. The few Mechanicum ships still capable of combat operations were limping slowly to refuges in the outer reaches of the system, and paid little heed to the oncoming Imperial ships as they took up station in high orbit over the region bounding Olympus Mons. From above, the warriors of the Emperor could see that the Red Planet itself bore the scars of battle fresh and terrible upon its face. Smoking ruins stood across the red plains of Mars, a silent testament to the ferocity of the struggle being waged, even as the Imperial commanders looked on. In the vast Cassini crater, where once had stood the great engine yards of High Magos Ahotep, there was now a sea of nuclear fire, and the forge veins of the Ismenius Lacus were infested with a twisted strain of the Life-Eater virus. Entire Titan legions marched and fought and died, and millions of warriors were already engaged in battle, a force of arms so far beyond that which Sigismund and Diaz had brought that any attempt to retake Mars entire was doomed to utter failure. Yet Sigismund, ever bellicose in the face of the enemy, would brook no immediate withdrawal. In private council with Camba Diaz and Arcas of the Custodian Guard, he railed at the perfidy of those that would defy the Emperor and his impotence in the face of their betrayal. Arcas, whose duty bound them to the protection of the Emperor's person and not the domains of the Mechanicum, looked on the Space Marine's rage with indifference, but Camba Diaz, unperturbed by his brother's fury, proposed a means by which they might fulfill Dorn's orders and assuage their honor both. All across the ships of their small squadron, warriors rushed to their dropships. each girded for battle, for none knew what might await them on the surface of Mars in the wake of the tragedy that had befallen it. Within hours of the order to drop being given, assault ships burst through the ash-laden clouds that hung over the Martian landscape. The first wave of craft all bore the yellow heraldry of the Imperial Fists, for Sigismund had insisted he be first to make landfall. The two full companies of Dorn's finest warriors, most clad in bulky Terminator plate, were disgorged by Stormbird along the edges of Mondus Oculum, the city of Fabricator Locum Cain. Unsure of Magos Cain's loyalties, the Imperial Fists deployed in combat formation with Sigismund at their head, banners flown high for all to see their allegiance. Even as Sigismund awaited for Cain's reply, Camber Diaz had already received his. At Mondus Gamma, Magos Lucas Crom announced his fealty at the barrel of a gun, a veritable blizzard of energy beams cutting into the first landing craft to approach his forge fane. Captain Diaz diverted his craft to the high plains of the Solis Planum, the cautious warrior reluctant to throw his limited manpower into the teeth of an unknown foe's defences. The landings at Epluvium Maximal fared even worse, for that forge fane was already under siege, and the Saturnine rams committed to the assault knew not which forces were friend and which foe. A murderous point-blank battle erupted at the foot of the forge fane's walls, the Solar Auxilia forced to defend themselves on all sides for over an hour before they could establish that Epluvium Maximal and its defenders fought for the Emperor. For an hour, Sigismund had listened to the coded signals on his Vox, charting the flow of battle as the gloom of evening grew around him. With his allies all engaged in battle, he arrayed his own troops. Terminators with bulky storm shields moved to the fore in preparation for the assault, and a trio of Leviathan dreadnoughts spun up their siege drills, while the lesser troops took position to the rear. With the terrifying efficiency that was the hallmark of the Imperial Fist, the ranks closed and fell into formation, the warriors moving almost as one, Sigismund poised to order them into battle. Then the gates of Mondus Oculum opened. The gates of hell. On the opposite side of the Noctis Labyrinthus, Camber Diaz returned to the fight. With his initial landings turned back, he had no intention of conducting a hurried or ill-planned assault, and instead relied on a careful strategy to defend Archmagos Chrome's defences. Imperial Fist Seeker squads, their yellow heraldry smothered in red Martian dust, opened fire from carefully selected positions to pin down defenders on the walls of Mondus Gamma. Furious salvos of Tempest bolts did no damage to the fortifications, but scythed down any tech thrall foolish enough to give fire in return, and covered heavy weapons teams as they took position. Once in place, Imperial Fist warriors, wielding missile launchers and las cannons, placed precise fire on carefully selected gun towers, opening a small but critical weakness in the overlapping fields of fire of the defenders' orbital defenses. Within moments, the night sky above Mondus Gamma was set ablaze, as 100 drop pods punctured the clouds and speared into the opening in the city's fortifications. Slamming into the outer precincts of Mondus Gamma's eastern district, the drop pods disgorged a full company of battle-hardened Imperial Fists, a host of the finest warriors in the Imperium, ready for battle. Volleys of mass-reactive bolts tore into tech thralls and Vorax automata at point-blank range, blasting apart the light armor of these troops. Heavier Domitar automata served as a more serious threat, their ceramite plating proof against small arms, but their limited mobility left them isolated as the Imperial Fist stormed forward to seize key objectives across the eastern district. First of all was the outer wall gatehouse, its armored doors torn from its hinges by melter bombs before Camber Diaz led the warriors of the initial landing into battle with the mass of tech thralls that waited within the walls. Second were a string of macro warehouses along the inner edge of the district, vast structures filled with armoured containers that made for brutal battlefields. Within their cavernous walls, the small Space Marine units held a critical advantage over the lumbering Thanatar automata, able to easily outflank and confound the limited combat engrams of the foe. Moreover, these huge warehouses were filled with war gear intended to swell Horus's ranks, and the Imperial Fists were quick to turn these weapons against the foe. Indeed, the third target to fall, the District Automata Command Relay, did so at the hand of a squad of Vindicator siege tanks in sea green colors, now crewed by Imperial Fist warriors. The tanks blasted apart the foundations of the tower and crippled the Tech Priest commander's ability to update the control engrams of their automata. Within the space of a few short hours, Camber Diaz had penetrated the walls of Mondas Gamma and seized control of the eastern districts. The Traitor Mechanicum defense force was falling back, dead or rendered inoperable, and his warriors had seized a vast trove of munitions and armored vehicles, many of which had been put to immediate use. As combat entered a lull, Captain Diaz ordered the Jovian Solar Auxilia to begin their landings and set other warriors to recover the material he had seized from the foe. At Mondas Gamma, it seemed the Dawn's orders could be made practicable, that a victory could be gained on the soil of Mars. Grim tidings. Even as Camber Diaz fought within the walls of Mondas Gamma, Sigismund stood within the halls of Mondas Oculum. However, he had fought no grand battle, but instead found that Magos Kane stood firmly with the Emperor and was invited into the city as honored guest. Mondas Oculum had seen little battle since the scrap code had rendered Mars silent. Kane City seemingly spared the ravages of war for some unknown purpose. This had ended with the arrival of Sigismund's warriors, and now the Myrmidon cadres for which Mondas Oculum was famed were under sporadic attack all along the perimeter. Even as Sigismund and Kane took counsel together, they received reports of explosions amongst the outer refineries on the far side of the city from previous attacks. With the combat automata of Mondas Oculum ill-suited to rapid change in tactics and deployment, Sigismund himself led 100 of his Space Marines to secure the city's flank. Expecting to encounter some wayward horde of tech thralls whose weapons would pose little threat to heavily armored Space Marine Terminators, Sigismund pressed forward in a bold assault. Yet this attack faltered when his warriors were halted by precise fire with Nemesis bolters. The Loyalists traded fire with a foe their equal in skill and war gear, clad in dull blue power armor, marked with the symbol of a Hydra, the Alpha Legion. These warriors should have been their brothers, for their Primarch had joined the Istvan Cincha fleet Dorn had sent to Istvan, yet here they took up arms against the Imperial Fists without hesitation. Shocked to their core, Sigismund and his warriors faltered for a brief moment. Pinned by fire from multiple angles, the blood of their fellow Imperial Fists now spilt upon the red Martian dirt. Roused to fury, Sigismund charged forwards, incensed that Space Marines would dare go to war against their Emperor, his bodyguard attempting to shield him with their own bodies. The Alpha Legion marksman, having baited him into the open, took full advantage and might have slain the Imperial Fist's first captain were it not for the intervention of a cohort of Kane's Thalax, the cyborgs jetting through the tangled industrial landscape with impossible precision to outflank the traitors. Caught now between the probing blast of the Thalax's lightning guns and Sigismund's reckless charge, the Alpha Legion knew that they had lost the advantage and abandoned their position. By the time Sigismund and his men arrived, there were only shell casings and blast marks to show the enemy had ever been there. The city was secure, yet the Imperial Fists knew full well that the Alpha Legion would return, and Sigismund feared for his brothers at distant Istvan. For if Alpharius had pledged himself to Horus, then how many other Primarchs might be false? Duty was the only salve for his worry, and he returned to Fabricator Locum Kane with the grim news. In response, the loyal Magos set all the defenses of his city to shield the Imperial forces from the effects of the scrap code and awakened the full might of his Tagma. Rank upon rank of silent combat automata and intricately wrought tanks roused from their artificial slumber. These fearsome combat assets he placed at the disposal of Dorn's emissary for the protection of Mundus Oculum, for if the Istvan fleet had failed, then the treasures within the city would be even more vital than Dorn had at first believed. The Eye of the Storm. Even as Kane and Sigismund reviewed the army with which they would defend their Emperor's hold on Mars, Captain Diaz took stock of his own troops. He had won a foothold within the walls of Mundus Gamma, but at a cost in lives he could ill afford. Of the brace of companies which he had landed, the 10th part were now lost. Nearly 200 Space Marines dead, and but a handful of wounded. For such were the weapons wielded by the warriors of the Mechanicum, that even the slightest wound was fatal. Their cannon-expelling bolts of pitch-black flame that cut through armor with silent fury, or gouts of radiation potent enough to rot a Space Marine's flesh within his armor. Victory at Mundus Gamma was within his grasp, but would need more troops to consolidate any gains the Space Marines might win. And so, Camber Diaz committed the last of the task force's reserves to his position. 40,000 warriors of the Jovian Grenadiers, organized in the solar auxiliar pattern made famous by their ancient rivals, the Saturnine Rams, grounded 8 kilometers outside the walls of Mundus Gamma. Their lumbering dropcraft could not risk the servitor-slaved guns still active in Mundus Gamma, leaving the infantry to marshal in the Solus Planum, disembarking heavy equipment and forming their tertio before moving to Camber Diaz's aid. The Space Marines would have to hold alone until they arrived, but Camber Diaz had little intention of waiting idly while the traitors recovered from his initial onslaught. Taking his most elite warriors, Imperial Fist Seekers, with a variety of deadly melter weaponry capable of burning through even the densest ceramite armor, Camber Diaz set forth to buy time for his allies to gather. Having taken the measure of his foe, Camber Diaz selected his targets not for their tactical value, but in order to confuse and distract the limited combat algorithms of Lucas Crom's automata. At Transit Junction 993G, Camber Diaz and 50 Space Marines, aboard a pair of Mastodon heavy transports still sporting Sons of Horus colors, threw aside the small garrison of Tekthrals in a brief and one-sided slaughter. The Imperial Fists then held their position for half an hour, as automated defense protocols directed disparate patrols of Castellax and Vorax combat automata against them. The Imperial Fists then held their position for half an hour, as automated defense protocols directed disparate patrols of Castellax and Vorax combat automata against them. These unfeeling metal warriors were thrown against the Space Marine lines a few at a time, no more than a dozen hulking automata in each attack. Though vastly outnumbered, the Mechanicum steel cohorts still reaped a deadly toll, for only melter blasts or power blades could pierce their ceramite hides with any certainty. Camber Diaz himself was wounded by the plasma mortar of a towering Thanatar automata before he could sever its legs, and his warriors finished it off with combi melter blasts. With the time bought in blood, the Imperial Fists rigged the junction with melter bombs, destroying it and crippling the defenders' ability to defend their heavy armor. This was but one of dozens of separate hit-and-run attacks conducted by Camber Diaz's warriors, though not all would go as well. Caught in the midst of sabotaging one of many auxiliary power exchanges, 24 Imperial Fists were overwhelmed by a horde of modified combat servitors, the Centurion in command choosing to immolate himself and the power exchange as his warriors' weapons exhausted their ammunition and the Imperial Fists were overrun. These deaths were not in vain, for Camber Diaz's strategy had thrown the defenders into chaos. Even though his small force was vastly outnumbered, the unwieldy hosts of combat automata and tech thralls proved incapable of countering his unpredictable onslaught. For while their weapons were the match of any ordnance borne by Diaz's troops, they could not bring them to bear in numbers sufficient to stop the Imperial fists. The greater part of Diaz's force still remained within the eastern district and had seen only sporadic combat, easily holding the munitions depots that they had seized, stood amid the ruin of yet another cogitator nexus. It seemed to Diaz that perhaps victory on Mars might still be within their grasp. A storm on the horizon. At Mondus Oculum, Kane's Tagmata, now roused to war in their full number, faced only desultory assaults. Packs of disorganized tech thralls emerged from the howling storms that racked the wastelands around Mondus Oculum to throw themselves at the city's defenses with suicidal abandon. Myrmidon battle-clades wearing Kane's heraldry tore them apart with fire from their cannon arrays, those few that made it to the walls of the city cut down by power axes so large that only the enhanced Myrmidons could wield them. The battle priests amongst a few of Kane's servants to welcome war now that it had arrived. Yet despite the choler of the Myrmidons, this doldrum of skirmish and slaughter was not true war, and posed no real threat to Mondus Oculum. It was as though the traitor forces had been abandoned by the will of their creators and left to fend for themselves. No word, neither threat nor demand for surrender, had been received from Kelbor Hall or Lucas Crom, and only the least of their minions had been released to persecute their traitorous war. None amongst the loyalists could doubt that some great work had drawn them away, and that its intent was most likely their destruction. Despite this threat, the forges of Mondus Oculum did not cease as battle raged on its doorstep, and from its factoria came an unending tide of weapons and war machines intent for use by the Legiones Astartes. Kane, ever a man of his word, would brook no compromise in his obligations to Dorn and the Imperium. As an adept of the machine cult, he intended to make use of every second to the fullest, fighting not with bolt and blade, but with manufactoria and code script. 18 hours passed, the roar of furnaces and factoria drowning out the sporadic boom of cannon and missile. Sigismund waited impatiently, torn between his desire to bring the fight to the traitors and his orders to defend the city, until certain reports flickered through the local noosphere caught his eye. Flickering and garbled pict captures showed vast hosts of tech thralls battling along the perimeter of the city as vast shadows loomed in the distance, and among the sprawling skirmishers was the briefest glimpse of blue armor. Sigismund had no concern for the lowly foot soldiers of the Mechanicum or vague shadows, but his pride would not allow him to ignore even the smallest chance of bringing their Alpha Legion to bay. Mustering his warriors, he left Kane to tend to production schedules and set forth to battle. At the western edge of Mondus Oculum, Sigismund and his warriors found the defences in chaos. Kane's guardian Castellax maniples had been eliminated with precision strikes, and the outer perimeter breached. A horde of wretched tech thralls and sand-scored Vorax automata flooded into the city's precincts. Desperate cohorts of loyalist Stalax marked amid the mass of flailing metal claws by the actinic blue flare of their lightning guns as they strove to hold back the foe. Leading his warriors into the heart of the battle, Sigismund and his resolute Terminator phalanx matched power blades and plasma blasts against the craft of the traitor Magi and proved the might of the Legiones Astartes. Yet for each neuro-slaved wretch they cut down, 2 more stepped forward to face the Imperial fists. Unlike the previous attacks, this was no mindless raid, but a full-scale assault. Amid the melee, Sigismund found no honourable battle, only an endless and numbing slaughter, as the last of the automata and neuro-slaved warriors were cut down. The mindless creatures fought with a dull monotony, never ceasing the fight, but no match for the fierce skills of the Legiones Astartes. The Alpha Legion had long since passed into the city's interior, leaving the mass of traitorous Mechanicum thralls to delay any pursuit, wielding duty as a weapon to pin Sigismund at the broken walls of Mundus Oculum. Were the Imperial Fist to retreat in search of Alferes' sons, then Cain's city might prove impossible to hold, forcing Sigismund and his brothers to keep the horde at bay until lumbering Myrmidons arrived to blunt the attack with their heavy guns. For an hour they fought, and lost but a dozen of their number in exchange for hundreds of the foe, and then the tide turned. A sudden roar swelled in the distance, but it was not the guns of Cain's battle priests, and a brutal explosion ripped apart an entire squad of Terminator armored Imperial Fist Huskars. The looming shadows on the horizon, no longer obscured by storm or scrap code interference, were revealed as the immense war titans of the Legio Mortis. Still kilometers distant from the city, they could rain deadly fire upon the defenders, who had no weapon or engine of war to match the overwhelming power of the Titans. Sigismund felt no fear at their approach, but it struck a bitter blow to his pride that he could not hope to even delay the approach of the Titans, nor hold Mundus Oculum against them. The Imperial Fist fell back upon the forged fanes at the heart of the city, the roaring of their combi bolters marking their passage, there to bring news to Fabricator Locum Cain that his city was doomed. The Beast Unleashed. Even as the Titans loomed over Mundus Oculum, Cambodius came face to face with a threat no less dire. Lucas Crom had revealed the labor that had kept him from the battlefield, and loosed a horde of twisted monstrosities into his own halls. Metal giants which bore the crude likeness of Castellax and Vorax automata, but were driven by a hungry and vicious new intelligence. They fought utterly unlike those dull iron brutes that Captain Diaz had bested again and again in previous battles, no longer blindly following the dictates of limited combat algorithms, but instead adapting and learning as they tore into his isolated vanguard. Captain Diaz found himself lured into ambush by heavily corrupted Vox signals on Imperial Fist channels, blood-smeared automata using the corpses of fallen Space Marines as bait to draw out the bulk of the Imperial Fist vanguard. Caught now by iron monsters that used his own wiles against him, Captain Diaz led the surviving Imperial Fists in a breakout, expending their reserves of melter charges to blast free of that hell of hungry metal. Of the hundreds that Captain Diaz had led forth, barely 50 would make it safely back to the Imperial Fist foothold in Mundus Gamma's eastern district. Squadrons of predators, armor sea green, in stark contrast to the proud gold worn by the crew, gave fire in thunderous volley to hold back the onrushing metal tide. The heavy guns stalling and then turning back the ravenous automata, whose numbers appeared to far outmatch those of the defenders. Revealed now in open battle, Lucas Crom's creations made plain the forbidden knowledge he had demanded for his loyalty to Horus's cause. Chrome had sacrificed all others of his servants that he might muster these monsters and test their might against that of the Space Marines, matching his own masterpieces against those of the Emperor in open battle. Had it not been for the arrival of the Jovian Grenadiers, the Imperial Fists would have perished in the crucible of Chrome's ambition. The skill at arms of the Legiones Astartes was the equal of Chrome's murderous new creations, but the numbers were too few in the face of the horde that fell on them. The superior gene craft that produced the Space Marines demanded years before it came to fruition, while Lucas Crom had produced a vast host of iron abominations in the short span of silence that had preceded Mars's revolt. Now thousands of solar auxilia arrived at last to add their numbers to the defense. Volleys of Volkite beams and las fire loosed in support of the Imperial Fist's own guns, and stalling the oncrushing horde. Aethon's sentinels lumbered out of the wastes to spit volleys of rockets into the automata, while the armoured bulk of Dracosan transports formed makeshift barricades from which the defenders fought. It was a brutal stalemate that cost the Loyalists hundreds of lives with each passing hour, and even though they inflicted no less harm on their foe, the automata did not relent. Camber Diaz could not abandon the wars, for that would see the wealth of munitions and war gear he had captured to the foe, yet nor could he hold indefinitely against the sheer numbers of Lucas Chrome's debased creations. His hearts heavy in the face of defeat, he gave the order to begin the evacuation. They would hold their ground only as long as it took to retrieve the key assets that they had seized, and no longer. Mundus Gamma was lost to the Imperium, and no effort he might make could change that. The Wrath of Mars. Under the guns of the Legio Mortis, Sigismund was forced into his own evacuation, even as Camber Diaz was beset by the creations of Lucas Crom. Shell bursts and immense energy beams demolished entire districts of Mundus Oculum with impunity. As the Titans advanced on Sigismund's defences, their war horns blared in challenge. Squadrons of Loyalist Stalax buzzed around their knees like impotent flies, and even the heaviest weapons available to the Imperial fists were little more than irritants. This was no battle, but a slaughter that the princeps of Legio Mortis stretched out for their own morbid amusement. Yet, in the depravity of his foe lay Sigismund and Kane's only hope. For as the Titans hunted and slew the defenders, amid the edge of the city, Kane's servitors and Magi laboured to load thousands of suits of newly produced Mark VI armour and other vital supplies aboard waiting shuttles. Each blast of titanic cannon in the distance signalled the deaths of yet more brave warriors, but also that of a new shuttle launched skywards to shelter in the ships that had brought Sigismund to Mars. Determined squads of yellow-armoured warriors waited amidst the wreckage of Mundus Oculum as the city was razed about them. They held their fire, ignored the Titans, and waited for the knights that preceded them to pass by, unleashing salvos of missiles into their rear armour to wound the hunting dogs of Legio Mortis. Thanatar automata in Kane's livery fell upon the wounded knights, blasting them apart with salvos of plasma and the impact of shock charges. Yet even such heroics could only slow the traitors down, for the knights were the least of their weapons. In the heart of the ruin, Sigismund fought his own battle, determined to be the last warrior to leave the fray. He had already seen Kane evacuated, though the two had almost come to blows before the Archmagos would accept the need for him to flee his own city. Now, without Kane's guiding hand, the automata of his Tagma had reverted back to their basic programming, and the surviving Castellax and Thanatar of Mundus Oculum surged forth in a last suicidal assault. They cared not for their comrades, as they were blasted apart by cannon fire, nor for the futility of their onslaught, only that they tore and rent the enemy before they fell. Under Sigismund's command, the Imperial fists withdrew with measured stoicism and guns blazing, reaping a toll on the thralls that had run ahead of the Titans, and blunting the assault of the knights by ambush and sheer brazen courage. As his warriors and the last remnants of Kane's Tagma held back the foe, Sigismund had one final duty to perform: the destruction of Mundus Oculum's primary data fane, to ensure the Mark VI templates did not fall into traitor hands. There he came face to face at last with the Alpha Legion and the warriors that led them. The traitors in the midst of a surprise attack upon the Myrmidons that stood watch over the vault. The Oathbreakers had come for the data templates, thinking that the Sons of Dawn would abandon them, and the few warriors left to protect them in order to save the bulk of their forces and the stocks of Mark VI armour in Kane's vaults. They had not reckoned with Sigismund's sheer stubbornness, and Dawn's champion thundered into their ranks in support of the Myrmidons that defiantly stood sentinel over the data fane. For the first time, the Black Sword took the lives of Space Marines, as Sigismund cut a path through the sons of Alfarius. At his back, the brute forms of the Myrmidons launched a blistering salvo of gunfire that drove back the foe and granted Sigismund time for one strike before he was overwhelmed. Powered by his rage and frustration, Sigismund ran through his opposite, pinning the blue-armored warrior to the broken walls of the city as the lesser warrior scattered into the ruins. Yet his victory was hollow, as the mocking laughter of the dying Alpha Legion praetor told him that the data had already been extracted by the traitors. Sigismund quit the dying city, as the Legio Mortalis obliterated it in an orgy of destruction that blinded them to the lesser warriors at their feet. A coded signal sent the last of his troops to their shuttles, leaving him the last loyal warrior to stand within the city, surrounded only by the dead. With a flick of his wrist, Sigismund cut free the head of the blue-clad traitor and left it in the ashes of Mars to watch as he departed, unbroken and ready to continue the war on other battlefields. The Embers of Hope. Sigismund's shuttle blasted clear of the city as its last towers fell, fleeing the Titan's wrath with a treasure of armor and data secure in its holds. Captain Diaz, far across the Syria Planum, watched him go before returning to his own desperate battle. His warriors lacked the assistance of any adepts of the Mechanicum. Indeed, Lucas Crom had turned all of his city against them, and its systems and cogitators fought them with the same dark cunning as did the horde of warped automata at the walls. Lights flared to blind the defenders, or fell into sudden darkness to leave them defenseless against the roving automata, while supposedly sealed sally ports and gates loosed hordes of Skylax drones and horribly altered tech thralls upon the loyalists. The slaughter on the walls of the Eastern District slowed the loading of the captured munitions and war machines. More guns were turned to aid the desperate solar auxiliary on the barricades than were loaded onto the vulnerable dropships hidden beyond the embattled city. With the bulk of the able-bodied warriors, Space Marine and Auxiliary alike, now struggling to hold Lucas Crom's terrifying creations at bay, there were few left to salvage the spoils of war. A treasure of armor, munitions, and war machines lay within their grasp, if they could but find a way to carry it to safety. Camber Diaz faced a terrible decision. The strength and skills of his Space Marines would see the vital material to the dropships, but would leave the Jovian Grenadiers at the mercy of Lucas Chrome's berserk horde. Yet, even the combined force of arms of the Imperial Fists and Solar Auxilia could not stop the tide of automata, only die together in futile but honorable defeat. Captain Diaz did not hesitate. He gave the order for the Imperial Fists to fall back and complete the evacuation. He knew that his orders had doomed thousands of loyal warriors, but the munitions they saved could well mean the difference between victory and defeat in a war far greater than this small battle. Leaving the Jovian Grenadiers to hold the walls as long as they could, the Imperial Fists recovered the bounty of Mondus Gamma. They set out into the Solis Planum, hounded by screaming Voltorax Stratos automata that descended from the skies to assault them. Their harrowing retreat was made worse by the vox chatter that followed them, for the Jovian Grenadiers made no desperate pleas for their lives, but began to chant the ancient funeral dirges of Jupiter. The sound of their brave defiance as they fought and died tormented the Imperial Fists more than any enemy's spite, and each of Dawn's sons wished that they might abandon their duty and turn to fight alongside them. At the very edge of the Solar Planum, in sight of the dropships, Camber Diaz halted the last captured Spartan assault transport and turned to give one final salute. Only the thunder of bolter fire kept the swarming Voltorax at bay, and all across the plains were the uncounted hordes of Chrome's automata, so thick he could barely see the last flickers of las fire in the distant city. Then a light flared within the Jovian perimeter, bright enough to sear even the Space Marine's eyes, and Camber Diaz feared the Jovians had set off the last of their munitions before they had been overrun. Yet, when his sight returned, he beheld no ruin, but rather a host of golden warriors. For the Custodes had come forth, teleporting directly into battle, a feat few could match, and cut a path through the automata host. Lucas Crom had wrought a terrible amalgam of science and dark power in his automata, but they could not stand against the Emperor's own guard. Solar Arcas and their warriors formed a bulwark of spinning power blades, each stroke claiming a Techthral's head or an automata's limb. They held at bay a horde that could not be counted, while the ragged remnants of the Jovian forces beat a hasty withdrawal across the wastes. Even in retreat, the Solar Auxilia held to their courage, falling back by section and firing as they went. Captain Diaz could not abandon such courageous warriors, and signalled for those ships that were fully loaded to blast off, holding only the last few, deploying his own retinue to act as rearguard. Diaz held the remaining ships against all foes until the last of the Jovian grenadiers were either aboard the ship or dead on the plains of Mars. Still firing as boarding ramps sealed, Captain Diaz gave the final order of the Martian expedition, and the ships roared into orbit. A blinding flash marked the end of the battle, as the warriors of the Legio Custodes initiated a teleport, leaving behind an entire drift of wrecked automata and cleaved thralls, with no hint of gold amidst the ruin. The spoils of victory. The Imperial troops regrouped in order, a ragged and battered band. They had suffered grievous casualties, but succeeded where lesser warriors would have fallen. Secure in the holds of their ships was a wealth of armor and munitions, enough to calm Dorn's fears for his defense of Terra, and to hold at bay any immediate assault by the traitors now sworn to Horus. Even more valuable, they bore the latest of Mars' creations, the Mach 7 designs and its architect, Fabricator General, to safety in the Imperial court. Though they had failed to drive the traitors from Mars, they had distilled from that defeat a victory of sorts. They had both the tools and information to arm any future expedition and to forestall the traitors on other fronts, and they had remained alive to fight again on other battlefields. As the Loyalists left to rot on the ashen plains of distant Istvan V had learned, the war that had begun with the death of innocents would be neither swift nor restrained. It would rage for more than a decade and ravage the galaxy entire. What had begun in silence would end only in deafening tumult and bitter rage. The Perditum Incursion. By the opening months of 007, Millennium 31, the fires of war upon Mars had dulled to mere embers. The traitors had claimed control of the Red Planet, their apocalyptic hosts annihilating all who resisted the Fabricator General's dominion. Those loyalists upon Mars who managed to escape this onslaught had been forced to retreat to the secluded places of the world, secreted away amongst labyrinthine layers of long-dead industry and sallying forth in ever-diminishing numbers to do brief but bloody battle with their dark mechanicum counterparts. So too had the teeming traitor hosts conducted their own withdrawal behind Mars's rusted dunes, keen to hide their numbers and activity from the prying eyes of the Loyalist blockade, which now hung in orbit beyond the shattered halo of the Ring of Iron. And so had Mars remained since the schism, a blank mask behind which the dark industry and vast arsenal of the Trita Mechanicum turned to purposes unknown, forming a poisonous canker at the very heart of the Loyalist domain. On Terra, the office of the Sigillite fixed a watchful eye upon the Forge World Primus, garnering what intelligence they could from a complex web of informants, sleeper agents, and those Loyalist survivors who had remained upon the planet. From the spires of the Imperial Palace, Malcador had begun to orchestrate a discreet effort to supply the Loyalist Martian resistance. Clandestine drops of supplies and armaments calculated to sustain a proxy war without provoking the full wrath of Kelbor Har's armies. Endless whispers brought accounts of traitor plots to the Sigillite's ear, but by 226007, Millennium 31, a single intelligence report occupied Malcador's focus. Archgenerator Kefram Ungur, a Martian genewright who had once travelled amongst the Emperor's own coterie during the middle years of the Great Crusade, and initially presumed slain due to this association, had been identified amongst several high-ranking incarcerated loyalists upon Mars. Within a vast prison structure known as the Perditum Incendor, Archgenerator Ungur was said to have been put to work alongside a host of Magos Biologus adepts to some dark end. Supplied with tissue samples and genetic material believed to include that of the Emperor's own custodian guard. In the mind of Malcador, and those with whom he had shared this information, the most probable task to which the Archgenerator might be turned by the Martian traitors presented a dire threat. Ungur's insight into the custodian's physiology, in particular, raised the alarming possibility of a bioweapon tailored specifically to target the Emperor's bodyguard. To Constantine Valdor, Captain General of the Legio Custodes, there was but one possible response: an overwhelming assault to see all efforts towards such a project utterly destroyed and all record of its existence expunged. Despite the zeal with which the Legio Custodes sought to pursue this course of action, its probability brought immense risk. The Perditum Incendor lay far within the heartlands of the Traitor Mechanicum upon Mars. Any significant attack upon the facility would carry the potential to reignite mass warfare upon the Red Planet, something the Imperial War Council was unwilling to risk until the greater movements of Horus and his allies in their war against the Emperor had been established. Anticipating such an appraisal, Malcador had set into motion his own ploy to deal with this prospective threat. With a major offense deemed unviable, the Sigillite turned to more subtle means, for which the perfect instrument had been delivered to Terra in recent weeks. Battered and scarred from its voyage, the battle barge Avenger had emerged from the warp at the Sol system's edge, carrying roughly a third of those Raven Guard, the 19th Legion, who had survived the Istvan V massacre, alongside their somber Primarch, their course set upon the Imperial throne world. Seeking the means to rebuild his sundered legion, Corax could ill afford to dismiss the proposal which Malcador set at his feet. The Sigillite intended to dispatch the Raven Lord and his accompanying sons to the Red Planet, leveraging their expertise at concealed warfare to breach the edifice of the Perditum Incendor without invoking the ire of Kelbor Hal's myriad armies. To Corax, he offered the expertise of Archgenerator Ungur, a certain boon to the Primarch's efforts to reconstruct his legion, should the Raven Guard prove capable of extracting him, as well as a detachment of the Custodian Guard both to aid in this task and to assuage the choler of the Legio Custodes. Upon Mars itself, this host would need to ply a long and shadowed course to reach the traitor's prison undetected, to which Malcador's agents had secured the assistance of a fragment of the loyalist Martian resistance as guide amongst the hidden warrens that worm through Mars's dusty landscape. The Broken Halo. 10 days after the Avenger's arrival in system, it slipped anchor above the skies of Terra, setting course for the inner solar system, with the gilded form of the Legio Custodes cruiser Sojourn following smoothly in its wake. This strange pair plotted a path not to Mars itself, but the forge moon of Deimos, ostensibly to resupply the Raven Lord's mauled host from the planetoid's still loyal forge fanes. As it passed just beyond the Imperial Fist blockade, the Avenger rolled lazily, ventral launch bays casting a volley of Dreadclaw and Charybdis assault claws into the void, accompanied by a telltale surge in etheric energy from the Sojourn. Scores of shadow-grey assault pods plunged towards Mars's gravity well, but as they plied their silent course, the grand synchronicity of orbital mechanics dragged their true destination into reach: the Ring of Iron. Once the crowning glory of the Forge World Sovereign and its gateway to the stars, still hung about Mars, though its shattered mass continued to shed huge quantities of debris into the planet's meager atmosphere. One of the immense structure's continent-spanning fragments drifted inexorably into the path of the approaching Raven Guard strike force, its surface scarred with the aftermath of orbital collisions and ravening plasma fires. Ever a cautious general, the callous betrayal Corax and his sons had suffered at Istvan V had not rendered the Primarch any less circumspect, and he had no intention of making planetfall upon Mars in the manner of an onrushing army. As the Avenger had approached the Martian orbital sphere, the Raven Lord had assessed structural scans of the fragmenting ring of iron provided by the Imperial Fist blockade, and determined one sector of the collapsing construct the perfect vector to deliver his strike force to the Red Planet unnoticed. Almost 100 assault claws thundered into the broken circlet's adamantine skin, melter cutters flash boiling away void-hardened plate to disgorge blooded veterans of the 19th Legion within. In places, the orbital structure's still active defense systems attempted to repel the sable-clad legionaries. Swarms of Skylax Guardian automata shuddered into life, and automated sentry guns bracketed choke points. In response, the Raven Guard moved with a swiftness and surety born from months of bitter survival upon the black sands of Istvan V. Squads of assault marines and dark furies surged through the atmosphere-less chambers, jump packs sending them slamming into the awakening Guardian automata, whirling chainswords and crackling power blades cleaving away the Skylax's vicious mechadendrites until only their segmented cores remained to be rent apart in turn. Elsewhere, Seeker squads, or more Dathan cadres, bathed in placed heavy weapons in scalding blasts of energy, combi melters rendering the sentry guns to molten slag as the 19th Legion's hunters struck from shadow vents and access ways, clearing the path for their fellow brethren. Corax himself stalked the halls of the vast structure alone, a bleak helm obscuring his sullen features. Here, the Raven Lord had hoped to face a mindless horde of mechanicum constructs against which to vent his cold rage. But the foe had been few and far between, his greatest obstacle coming in the form of a maniple of wayward Domitar, which Corax had dispatched with little issue. Not only had the situation deprived the Primarch of a target for his suppressed choler, which had lingered with him since Istvan V, but it was accompanied by a disconcerting truth. The Raven Guard were not the first legionaries to walk these halls in the aftermath of the Ring of Iron Sundering. Scattered pockets of ruined battle automata and tech-thralls littered the orbital station's interior, each bearing the telltale signs of chainsword blow and bolter-round impact. Of the legionaries themselves, no trace could be found. Any casualties either carried clear of the ring, or else obliterated to conceal their provenance. In spite of the disquiet this brought Corax, the only clear path was to press on, and so he called forth his sons to rendezvous at their preordained target. As the vast fragment of the Ring of Iron continued its slow orbit, the reformed Raven Guard companies gathered amidst one of the structure's colossal planetward docking arms, greeted by the impassive golden visage of a near 100 custodian guard, whose teleport assault had deposited the warriors on target almost 2 hours prior. At their feet were piled the sundered remains of scores of Skylax, similarly roused by the sudden arrivals, though unlike the Raven Guard, whose armor showed the marks of the Guardian Automata's wrath, the Custodian's auramite remained unblemished. With naught but a nod passed between Corax and Shield Captain Arcas, recon legionaries of the 19th Legion set about their task. Across stanchions and bulkheads, the Raven Guard laid a network of melter bombs and seismic charges, weaving an artificial fault line at the point where the docking arm merged with the ring fragment's main bulk. The combined Loyalist host clustered within its central transit shaft as the explosives detonated in sequence, shearing off the docking arm in a storm of debris to begin its slow plummet towards Mars. Here the Custodians had activated a series of archaeotech devices teleported alongside their host from the Sojourn, gravitic dampeners intended to spare the Legionaries and Custodians from the otherwise lethal combination of their descent. With the untethered docking arm beginning to accelerate as it was pulled further into Mars's gravity well, the red planet's scant atmosphere did little to slow the wreck's fall. Blood-soaked sands. Just south of Mars's Solis Planum, the docking arm's calamitous impact bloomed outwards in a spreading wave of dust and debris, appearing no different to the scores of similar collisions which had followed the Ring of Iron sundering over a year before. Despite the innocuous facade this mode of entry presented to the Martian Mechanicum, the Loyalists ensconced within knew that it would only be a matter of time before the carrion feeders of Mars issued forth to scavenge what they could from the fresh impact. Even as the tortured wreck settled around them, the combined host of Raven Guard and Custodians set forth onto Mars's pitted surface, shrouded by the pall of red rust dust which clung in the air. From here, the Loyalists faced a day-long march northwards towards the rocky bluffs at the Solis Planum's southern edge, their allotted rendezvous with whatever enclave of Loyalist Mechanicum the Sigillite had managed to sway to their cause. At their head moved squads of swift-moving recon legionaries, plotting a course intended to obfuscate their movements as much as haste would permit, while the steadfast warriors of the Legio Custodes stood as rearguard, a force capable of seeing off all but the most capable of pursuers. It would not be long before such deployments would prove necessary, as Mars itself seemed to intercede on the traitor's behalf. Some 2 hours into the Loyalist march, as the turmoil of the impact site passed from view, the scree-blanketed plains which stretched ahead began to echo with haunting machine howls, and vox receivers chattered with snippets of distorted binaric cant. The cast-offs of Mars's bellicose industry had haunted the world's fringes for millennia, and while the opening conflicts of the Schism had burned entire swathes of the planet clean, these battles had spawned their own wrathful ghosts to linger amongst the wilderness. Ravening psi carnivora, mindless servitors, and discordant battle automata had all been drawn by the seismic reverberations of the docking arm's impact, and as they had closed in, deep-rooted combat engrams and stranger, more malevolent drives had seen them flock to the Loyalist column like a swarm of voracious predators. Some erupted from beneath drifts of crimson sand, others surged forth from yawning cave mouths, and more still simply raced headfirst across the desolate wastes. Against such a horde, the 19th Legion's mastery of decapitation strikes and hit-and-run warfare would matter little. While pushing onwards to their target, risked breaking apart the Loyalist column to be surrounded and torn apart piecemeal. Instead, the Raven Guard took on a defensive stance, taking as their redoubt the perimeter ridge of a nearby crater as the surrounding wastes began to seethe with the forms of onrushing constructs. Without a word, the golden-armored Custodes host flowed around them, their meager number spread alarmingly thin as they stretched across the crater's entire circumference. A single Custodian marched to each squad of sable-clad legionaries. Volleys of bolter fire thundered across the wastes, hundreds of Raven Guard opening fire in unison to cleave great gulfs in the throng of half-feral cyborgs as they charged up the crater's embankments. Those who did not fall to this fusillade were left at the mercy of the Custodians, whose guardian spears reaped a bloody toll amongst the ranks of their foe. Their staggered formation seemingly only to permit the warriors to exploit the full reach of their artificer-wrought weapons. From among this ring of sable and gold sallied forth units of assault marines and dark furies, their jump packs delivering them into the mass of constructs with bone-breaking force, divisions cleaving apart dozens of automata and hundreds of servitors, before once again rocketing skyward as the horde turned inward to crush them. For over an hour, the Loyalists battled constant waves of attacking constructs, long shadows from the setting sun, seeming to multiply the oncoming horde before at last the struggle was submerged in darkness, flashes of staccato bolt of fire painting the battlefield in nightmarish relief. Corax was ever in the thick of the fighting, descending alongside his bodyguard to counter any concentration of the attacking host which threatened the loyalist line, be they erratic battle automata or monstrous psi carnivora. Eventually, the flow of bellicose cyborgs stalled, their twitching remains piled about the crater's foot in a tide of rent iron and flesh. In exchange for thousands of servitors and scores of automata cut apart, the Loyalists had survived relatively unscathed. The wall of Raven Guard legionaries atop the crater's embankment never reached. Neither the Raven Guard, so recently mauled at Isstvan 5, nor the thinly spread Custodians could endure casualties with ease, however, so the loss of 24 assault legionaries and a pair of Custodes had ultimately fallen to overwhelming numbers during the battle delivered a sting no less potent. Pausing only to harvest the gene seed of their fallen, the Loyalist host set forth once more onto Mars's desolate plains, the growing edifice of the Solis Planum's southern rise, marking their goal across the northern horizon. Almost a day's travel brought no further sign of marauding cyber constructs, though passing rad schools ensured Auspex and Vox readings were rarely reliable. As the Raven Guard's recon squads reached the southern foothills of the Solis Planum, crackles of interrogatory Vox code assailed their comm systems, bearing the indistinguishable ident signifiers of the Sigilite's office. Emerging from the gloom ahead, the skeletal silhouettes of Skitarii pilgrims moved in cautious order. Bulkier forms of battle automata followed in their wake, after a brief standoff in which ident ciphers were proffered and verified in turn. Corvus Corax and Shield Captain Arcus met with their newfound compatriots. Emerging from the ranks of her counterpart pilgrims almost imperceptibly, First Ordinal Gao was no less war-scarred than her charges. Each dent and tear in her panoply attested to months of hard-fought survival in the wake of the traitor's seizure of Mars. To the Loyalist commanders, she delivered a simple ultimatum. She would guide the legionaries and custodians along the lengthy route to the Perditum Incendor, but upon arrival, she would not permit any accursed research uncovered there to endure. To her, such work was a perversion of the Holy Omnissiah's own divine craft, and she had oathed herself to a bond of expunction to see it unmade. Shadows and Sin. From their rendezvous point, the Loyalist strike force faced a northward journey across the entire length of the Solis Planum, the vast plateau now transformed into the heart of traitor Archmagos Lucas Fromm's forged domain. Its craggy expanse was studded with the myriad workings of martial industry, new and old. Mining wells sat shoulder to shoulder with colossal landing yards and immense reactor clusters. While such features made an overland route to the Perditum Incendor perilous, the legacy of Mars's industrial history also descended below the Solis Planum's desolate surface. Here, abandoned maglev tunnels, subterranean aqueducts, and half-collapsed storage vaults wormed their way through the plateau's rocky expanse, the haunt of mutated tech thralls and outcast magi. Into the shrouded warren, First Ordinal Gao led the legionary and custodian host, her own warband having become practiced at navigating Mars's labyrinthine ruins in the long months of flight and survival since the traitor's conquest of the Red Planet. The erratic journey beneath Mars's dunes forced the Loyalists to contend with tunnels on the verge of collapse, pockets of frenzied automata, and sporadic proximity of teeming traitor holdfasts, though each time the skills of their combined forces saw them through. From the Raven Guard's capabilities at obfuscation to the Pilgrim's techno-artifice, despite the differing origins of the three Loyalist subdivisions, their varying forms of augmentation afforded each the resilience to endure days of grueling travel without rest, the hosts stopping only to scavenge what supplies and munitions they could, and to follow First Ordinal Gau's pilgrims to administer to their temperamental automata charges. Once more the Loyalists encountered signs of an unknown legionaries Astartes presence. Fragments of shattered power armor and bolter casings of indistinguishable make, though if any of the host commanders deemed it noteworthy, they kept such insights to themselves. Each force amongst the Loyalist number was ill-disposed to easy camaraderie, bound to their own insular warrior cultures and dogma. While the Custodians had shed blood alongside Chorus's sons, no bond of kinship had been forged between the two bodies, with Shield Captain Arcus only ever exchanging words outside of their own companions when absolutely necessary. Such a distance could easily be attributed to simple unfamiliarity, but one small detail, seemingly noticed by the Primarch alone, gave Korax cause to bestow a greater meaning to this reticence. Arcus's adjutant carried aloft a magisterium vexilla, which bore all the hallmarks of a relic bestowed upon the younger shield captain for this particular duty, given the contents of its honor roll, which included some of the Legio Custodes' oldest and most famed victories. One gilded name engraved upon the vexilla's crest stood out in harsh relief to Korax, a grim reminder of the Custodians' past and a portent of the role they saw for themselves in this dark time. Mount Ararat. Necropolis. A week after they had set out into the darkness of the Solus Planum's subterranean depths, the Loyalist host finally reached the edge of the gargantuan cleft, within which the Perditum Incendor nestled. The last stint of their journey lay amongst the ruined shells of immense pipelines which bridged these canyons, their original purpose long forgotten, but their route running within 3 kilometers of the Hypocastum's sunken abyss. At 275007 Millennium 31, the Loyalists stepped out onto the red sands of Mars once more and began their assault on the Perditum Incendor. Once they had left the gloom of the half-collapsed pipeway, the Loyalists had little choice but a direct approach to the Hypocastum's yawning perimeter, the intervening 3 kilometers providing naught but sparse rock formations by way of cover. As a Loyalist host raced across this open ground, determined to reach the long-defunct geothermal well's edge with all due haste, it forked outwards into 3 distinct assault groups. To the west moved Commander Agapito Nev with a mass of the Raven Guard's Talon tactical companies, aiming for one of the 3 primary bridges which connected the Perditum Incendor's foreboding tower to the Hypocastum's angled walls, accompanied by 3 dozen Custodian Guard as a heavy reserve. Directly forwards surged First Ordinal Gau's entire reinforced Skitarii warband alongside the rest of the Custodians, taking a second transit bridge as their target, while Korax led the entirety of his jump-pack-equipped troops upon a path curved eastward along the borehole's rim. First Ordinal Gau's assault group had the shortest path to their target, and quickly became embroiled in a running firefight as automated defenses dispersed about their approach designated the Loyalist host as hostiles. Despite the torrent of shot unleashed against the assault group, these heavy rotor cannon emplacements had been intended to size down escaping inmates, and the rudimentary slugs only proved a hazard to the Skitarii pilgrims, who quickly closed ranks behind the armored forms of their accompanying automata. In response, Darkfire weapons immolated the emplaced weapons in moments with beams of howling unlight, before a maniple of Castellax were put to work tearing down the armored blast doors which sealed off the transit bridge ahead. To the west, Commander Nev's division faced similar opposition. Nemesis bolters dispatched the turrets with well-placed strikes to targeting oculi and power systems, though the turret's deactivation was swiftly followed by an onrushing horde of ad secularis tech thralls, as the overland bridge which formed their designated ingress route flooded with the Perditum Incendor's guardians. Here, disciplined bolter fire and coordinated blade work allowed the Raven Guard to press onwards, though the sheer press of bodies delayed the host as they inched along the bridge which spanned the hypocast's grim chasm. Against a counterpart mass of tech thralls which poured into the transit bridge ahead of the central assault force, the gleaming auramight of Shield Captain Arcus's custodians formed an unstoppable spearhead, guardian spears scything down handfuls of adsecularis with each sweep. For his own assault group, Corax had resolved not to allow his foe to set the stage of battle. Descending hundreds of meters into the hypocastum's pit on blazing contrails, his squads of dark furies and assault legionaries thundered onto the brass skin of a huge plasma conduit which had once siphoned the bountiful geothermic energy tapped by the well in ages past. Following the conduit to where it met the Perditum Incendia's central column, they carved a path inwards with melter bombs and crackling power blades, breaching the prison's defenses a dozen levels below its primary entrances. As the outpouring of adsecularis thralls above began to dwindle, warriors across the three formations made ready to face what they were certain would be heavy resistance as they breached the penitentiary tower. Within, they would find only the mouldering dead. The two upper assault groups moved into the tower in cautious order, sweeping chamber by chamber as they pushed towards the core sector where the Sigilite's informants had placed the prison's primary containment facilities. Among these outer chambers, no imminent cause for alarm was evident, many having simply served as garrison cloisters for the horde of tech thralls which had assailed them. Below, however, Corax's formation prowled through jail laboratories and workshops torn asunder, their ruin evincing no scrap of the research they had once contained, the signs of creeping corrosion suggesting that they had been abandoned some months ago. As the Primarch and his sons closed on the tower's core, desperate to find any sign of Archgenitor Ungur or scrap of his work, the dark truth was finally revealed to them. In a grand central chamber, once a lofty court from which the Fabricator General's menials administered his verdicts, the remains of the Perditum Incendia's inmates were piled in nightmarish displays. Executed en masse, they lay amidst the ruins of a ritual scene torn from the most accursed histories of old night, displayed in gruesome patterns according to some hellish design. Despite the rot which had long since set in, the room was still covered in the remnants of a strange hybrid of alchemical formulae and occult sigil, all daubed in the blood of the slain inmates. Here too was the same damage wrought across the outer laboratories evident, the gouges of huge metal claws carved through adamantine plate amidst the piled slain. Even as Corax's worst fears were confirmed, with the Archgenitor's remains identified amidst the dead, the dire implications of the clearly long-past slaughter manifested above. Recon squads and Pilgrim Ranger hosts, deposited as pickets around the Hypocast's edge, gave scattered reports of sudden eruptions from among the red sands before all transmissions ceased. Vox network suddenly dead, as bursts of scrap code overwhelmed the Loyalist comm systems and burned out their sensor feeds. In moments, the rear echelons of the two upper Loyalist assault groups were embroiled in pitched battle as twisted traitor automata charged across the transit bridges secured less than an hour before. The trap had been sprung, and now Corax and his compatriots had little choice but to wait as their foe manifested. Jaws of the Traitor. The Perditum Incendia was a vast lure, primed with false intelligence aimed at the ear of the Sigilite. Once again, it imprisoned the enemies of Mars, trapping the Loyalist host from easy escape within the same chasm which once served to sever recalcitrant magi from their domains. From among the red sands charged demon engines of barbed visage and murderous anima, scuttling beetle-backed blood slaughterers with bladed limbs and lumbering decimated colossi which spewed torrents of firepower as they brought their crushing siege claws within striking distance. Around them moved what once had been battle automata, though they had been corrupted in a myriad subtle ways and now possessed a malign intelligence which drove them beyond the bounds of any simple programmed behavior. Against the Loyalist division led by Commander Nev, this first wave of traitor cybernetica fell like a tidal wave, the sheer mass of ironclad bodies tearing through a score of Raven Guard legionaries as their charge crashed home. Powered blades sheared through ceramite, and point-blank energy discharges hurled warriors from their feet. The paltry bolter volleys that the rearguard tactical squad had managed to loose before impact, doing little against the hulking constructs. Despite this onslaught, the Raven Guard reorganized swiftly, withdrawing from their search of the upper levels around the entrance of the Perditum Incendor's huge transit bridge. Combi melter-armed Seeker and Mordathan squads making ready to immolate the towering automata as soon as the doleful sacrifice of their rearguard was spent. Beams of blistering heat turned the air blinding white as a score of melter weapons fired in unison, reducing a talon of blood slaughterers to molten slag as they charged forth, followed by a barrage of Scorpius bolts which chewed apart the first maniples of Vorax that followed. Successive fusillades hammered into the demon engines and corrupted automata which spewed from the transit bridge's terminus, tearing down dozens of constructs, but each new wave drew closer to the Raven Guard's line of defense before falling. Squads of despoilers drew their chainswords, knowing that a handful of legionnaires would be required to tear down each of the ravening automata, a grim formula that did not resolve in the 19th Legion's favor. As the warriors of deliverance made ready to sell their lives, golden-clad figures stepped forward to take their place. The 24 custodian guard who had accompanied Commander Nev's assault group made plain their determination to match blades with the abominable traitor constructs, standing silent and implacable as the demon engines closed in. Amongst the other loyalist assault group ensconced within the Perditum Incendor's upper levels, these corrupted constructs were faced by kindred cybernetica. The battered battle automata of First Ordinal Gao's conclave ushered forth into an iron-bound bulwark. Here the opening battles of the schism were repeated in microcosm. The corrupted traitor cybernetica pitted against their erstwhile counterparts, as Gao's Skitarii reformed behind them, while Shield Captain Arcus led the main bulk of their century deeper into the penitentiary tower. In spite of the caring administrations of the Skitarii pilgrims, months of grueling survival amongst the fringes of Mars had served the loyalist automata poorly, and unlike their attackers, their programming remained true to the imposed safety protocols established in the Treaty of Olympus. One by one, the cybernetica were torn down, the traitor automata seeming to take a malign satisfaction in their undoing. Seeing her charges falter, First Ordinal Gao commanded the final maniples of loyalist automata to retreat back to the pilgrims' line, that they might add the weight of their guns to that of the Skitarii as the dark mechanicum constructs closed. As the final maniples of Castellax and Domitar turned to face the pilgrims' ranks, a vicious shaking racked their adamantine forms. Some stumbled and fell, while others seemed to shut down entirely. Worse still, a handful turned their own weapons upon the Skitarii. Blasts of graphitic force and fusillades of bolt cannon fire butchering dozens of the weather-beaten cyborgs. Without hesitation, and in spite of the pain it brought her to see such avatars of the Omnissiah's wrath undone, Gao ordered her rangers to unleash their photon rifles against the compromised battle automata. Hands that had once cleaned and repaired the automata's battered carapaces now directed beams of searing energy to slice apart in fountains of sparkling flame, carving through the cybernetica by sheer weight of fire. The pilgrims would have no time to mourn, as from among the flaming wreckage charged forth a fresh mass of frenzied demon engines. Elsewhere, the burst of scrap code or unseen cyberthurgic malady which had afflicted the loyalist automata was felt in myriad ways. Helmet lenses painted nightmarish visions across the view of their wearers, weapon systems suddenly jamming or overheating and servos ceasing without warning. While temporary and sporadic, these incidents were as a pressure wave preempting a storm. building in intensity alongside a low, ominous rumble felt throughout the Perditum Incendor. With a thunderous detonation, the rock wall of the hypercast sheer cliff face burst open, and the prows of a trio of vast Ordinatus Actaeus siege engines cleared the rust-hued earth and delivered the aberrant signal's source. The overlord of the traitor host had arrived. The Scourge of Mars. Within the bowels of the Perditum Incendor, Corax had gleaned what he could of the situation above via redundant Vox systems undamaged by the scrap code released when the traitor's trap had been sprung. But even as he readied his assault group to ascend to the fight, these lower levels echoed with the tortured wails of their own Malefica constructs. Secreted within the penitentiary tower's depths, a score of blood slaughterers and a demon engine forged in the form of a vast, scuttling arthropod assailed the Primarch and his coterie. Awoken by the same scrap code posse which had initially severed Corax from the rest of the Loyalists. These lumbering constructs had forced the Raven Guard to take to the vaulted ceilings of the gigantic court chamber, diving from between buttresses to secure melter bombs and crack grenades to the blood slaughterers' glistening shells. 24 legionaries were cut apart by the rampaging constructs' flailing limbs, but gradually the demon engine host dwindled, while at the chamber's center, Corax faced down the colossal brass scorpion. The massive construct's blows shattered the granite floor of the courtroom, its tail cannon throwing up clouds of debris as shells traced the Primarch's path. But Corax vaulted over each of the monstrous engine swings, always just ahead of its barrage of shot. With each pass, his claws swung deeper, perforating the scorpion's brass hide in dozens of places until finally, leaping above its scuttling legs, he tore a vital cluster of power conduits from the construct's back, laying the nightmarishly sapient machine low. As the Sons of Deliverance took count of their dead, a new force approached, though the wound they would deal to the Raven Guard would be one of words, not blades. At the head of this custodian host, Shield Captain Arcus informed Corax that the number of traitor constructs above was utterly overwhelming. The first lines of defense had already failed, and within a handful of hours, every loyalist within the Perditum Incendor would be dead. As the shield captain cast a glance around the bloody contents of the chamber, Corax sensed a grim familiarity with the ritual trappings above them, only seeming to reinforce Arcus's verdict. They must demolish the penitentiary tower, obliterating as great a portion of the traitor host as possible, and destroying themselves in the process. To whatever end the traitors had drawn them to the world, only complete annihilation would ensure beyond doubt that their foe would be deprived of their unknown goal. Above, the other loyalists were already coordinating efforts to sever the transit bridges over which the dark mechanicum automata and demon engines poured, buying precious time to prepare the Perditum Incendor's end. The truth of what words were exchanged between the Primarch and the Custodian at this point are lost to history, but the core of their meaning is known. Corax refused to subject so many of his surviving sons to a meaningless death, having only just escaped their annihilation upon the black sands of Istavan V. The prospect of slipping the jaws of death only to die so close to terror, alone and unaided, was anathema to the Raven Lord, but to the eyes of Sola Morve Arcus, such despair was only cowardice and rank dereliction of duty. The shield captain spoke of a fate which awaited all Legiones Astartes, of a just reward for the arrogance and failure which had plunged the Imperium into civil war. In the dark heart of the Perditum Incendor, gilded spears and shadowed claws glinted with the prospect of violence. As the loyalist host teetered on the edge of internecine bloodshed, the momentous impact of the trio of Ordinatus Arctaeus drills shook the warriors from their reverie. If they yearned for violence, it had found them. At the Perditum Incendor's upper heights, a trio of detonations echoed in kind. Among Commander Nev's assault force, the 24 custodians who had stood fast in the face of the demon engine's onslaught had pushed forwards with momentous effort, peerless bladework scything down construct after construct, until finally the flow of demon engines had been forced back beyond the transit bridge's terminus. One by one the custodians fell, but the sacrifice allowed Captain Agapito's legionaries to saturate the bridge's end with melter bombs and breacher charges, and as the last custodian was run through by a decimator's huge siege claw, the bridge was severed by a vast detonation, its tangled ruin collapsing into the chasm below. Among First Ordinal Gao's force, the Skitarii's approach to destroying their own transit bridge was somewhat more pragmatic. 70 Pilgrim Rangers charged forward, their photon rifles' arcane power sources set to rapidly destabilize. Many would not make it past the demon engines and corrupted automata that barred their path to the bridge's entrance, detonations of howling, unreal light marking their end, but enough managed to endure the passage that a cascade of shrieking explosions tore the transit bridge asunder, stemming the flow of dark mechanicum constructs. A third detonation sounded from the far side of the hypercastum as the tertiary transit bridge opposite the Loyalist route of ingress collapsed in concert, though none amongst the Raven Guard, Custodes, or Skitarii could attest to the source of its destruction. Below, Corax's and Arcus's warriors were already embroiled in a brutal melee. From one of the Ordinatus, dark Mechanicus constructs had poured across the same network of long, defunct plasma conduits which had granted Corax and his sons ingress, the hulking form of Archmagos Lucas Crom striding at their heart, his cybernetic frame reinforced with the spoils of Mars's conquest. About him scuttled and lumbered the fruits of his latest research, strange fusions of cybernetica and esoterica, cyborgs whose mechanical implants writhe with a life of their own, and a cyclopean arachnid walker from which waves of hissing static seemed to emanate. Seeing at last the architect of the Loyalist misfortune, Corax's malaise was suddenly replaced with a blazing fury, and he leapt towards Archmagos with little thought for his bodyguard. Crom, however, had no interest in the Primarch's ire, directing his coterie of prototype constructs into the Ravenlord's path with a dismissive wave. Instead, the Archmagos turned his attention towards the custodian complement of the Loyalist force, ushering forth a dozen decimated demon engines against the Golden Host. Despite his martial prowess, Corax faced no easy victory against Chrome's bizarre retinue of prototype constructs, each invested with abilities and weapons beyond his ken. Slowed by his need for caution, Corax took Lucas Chrome's distraction as an opportunity to spare his sons further slaughter, directing them to withdraw and strike from the shadows as they had time and again throughout the wars of the Great Crusade. Across the gore-slicked floor of the massive courtroom, trios of custodians faced off against Chrome's demon engines, some prevailing as others fell, the swooping forms of Raven Guard legionaries often tipping the balance in their favor despite the Space Marines' unwillingness to commit to the melee. Chrome himself observed from afar, only intervening where a group of custodians were sure to fall, his immense chain blade chewing through auramite in precise sweeps before a gaggle of servitors dragged the corpses away. Across what vox bands remained usable, Commander Nev made contact with his Primarch, informing the Raven Lord that his tactical companies had engaged a flood of constructs issuing from another of the 3 Ordinatii Arcteas. Even if they managed to rebuff these fresh traitor hosts, however, the flow of cybernetica and demon engines from the surrounding waste had only been slowed. Recon squads reported the constructs were even now descending upon the Hypercarson's rocky cliffs on clawed limbs, clearly attempting to reach the lower conduits which bridged the yawning chasm to the Perditum Incendor. As such, First Ordinal Gao had acceded to shield Captain Arcus's determination, moving with the remainder of her tattered conclave to the long inactive plasma siphons which still sat at the core of the penitentiary tower, hoping to rouse the heavily damaged systems into catastrophic wakefulness to immolate the entire structure. Of the third Ordinatus and its host, nothing was known. The route by which its passengers had entered the Perditum Incendor should have brought them along a similar path to Archmagos Chrome's own force, but no sign of their number had been witnessed. Only the distant echoes of gunfire, including snatches of what might have been bolter reports. Within the Perditum Incendo's heart, a grueling stalemate had been reached. Crom had proven the capability of his demon engines, each the match of several custodian guard, but deprived of the hosts unleashed by his two other Ordinatii, victory would only be assured when the hordes of constructs from the surrounding wastes breached the lower levels. The Archmagos had overreached, and he would pay the price. With a screech of shorn metal, the Decimator engine at his side toppled, its legs cut out from beneath its looming torso by a pair of artificer-wrought meridian swords. With a single thrust, Shield Captain Arcus speared through the fallen construct's infernal reactor, their gilded plates scorched and bloodied, but their bladework undiminished. In less than half dozen paces, Arcus had carved through Chrome's servo-automata bodyguard, even as the Archmagos activated yet another esoteric device, voluntarily obliterating the core of one of his hulking demon engines to open a portal of yawning darkness. The cost Chrome would pay to reach this portal would be great. Of a dozen murderous blows, Chrome's vicious chain blade parried just 2, the rest cutting through layers of refractor-shielded armor and redundant systems. The Archmagos' iron-bound form was left a shattered wreck as he collapsed backwards into the portal, the merest moment before it snapped closed. Unlike more mundane automata, the demon engines rampaging amongst the penitentiary's tower's depths lost no degree of their malign intellect now their master had fled. Slowly the loyalists cut them apart, Corax having managed to fight off Chrome's menagerie of prototype monstrosities as his assault continued to harry the demon engines from above. Eventually, Commander Nev's assault group reached the fray, barrages of bolter and melter fire joined by more esoteric blasts, as a strange host of legionaries accompanying them added their own firepower to the loyalist effort. The Dark Mechanicum constructs were destroyed, though the effort had cost the Custodians dozens of warriors, while the Raven Guard had sacrificed over 100 legionaries fighting through the tower. Worse still, it was only a matter of time before the flood of demon engines scaling the Hypercastum's cliff face reached the Perditum Incender's lower levels, and the vicious shaking which began to grip the structure spoke of First Pilgrim Gao's success at awakening the plasma siphon nestled at the heart of the penitentiary tower. Facing annihilation, Corax turned to the anomalous band of legionaries which had met with Commander Nev's force. Their ceramite colored the rust red of Martian dunes. At their head walked a figure torn from the darkest days of Corax's past, a legionary who brought a mixture of unease and hope to the Primarch's heart. Cadus Nex stood before the Raven Lord once more, a warrior presumed dead upon Istvan V, and to whom Corax might have attributed greater fidelity with the traitor cause than his own. The Blood Crow spoke not of his passage to Mars, or his purpose there, though the damage and wear upon his armor spoke of long months of campaign. But he offered Corax escape, proffered up the same ancient tunnels from the Hypercast bows with which he had reached the Perditum Incender's heart. Into the darkness the Raven Guard fled, surviving once more where doom seemed inevitable. Exodus. The flare of the Perditum Incender's demise was visible to the Imperial Fist blockade high above Mars, the plasma detonation immolating the penitentiary tower in a single blinding flash. For several days, the fate of Corax and his sons was unknown to Terra, the possibility of their deaths amongst the prison's destruction growing increasingly certain in the minds of the Imperial War Council, until pre-arranged rendezvous codes were received by the captain of the 7th Legion vessel Undaunted 5 days after the Perditum Incender's demolition. Led by Cadus Nex, Corax and his legionaries had traced their way to a flight of hidden evacuation craft prepared in advance by First Ordinal Gao's pilgrim conclave, escaping Mars with naught but a bitter taste of ash. Less than an hour before the Perditum Incender's destruction, The Sojourn had arrived in Mars's orbit at tremendous speed, once again precluding a surge in etheric energy as the cruiser's teleportarum arrays activated at full power. Refusing all hails, the Legio Custodes vessel immediately departed for Terra, its passengers reserving their report for the ears of the Sigillite alone. A First Ordinal Gau's pilgrim conclave, it is still assumed that none survived the Perditum Incender's annihilation, though through some grim means their knowledge was yet stolen by elements of Lucas Chrome's Tagmata, whether by necrocortical probes of Skitarii who fell on the long march to the penitentiary tower, or as some hidden side effect of the scrap code burst which infected their accompanying automata. The Dark Mechanicum managed to acquire fresh knowledge of the distribution of several Loyalist cells upon Mars. What followed was a months-long purge, as Loyalist holdfasts were rooted out and utterly obliterated. Many of the attacking forces composed of esoteric new machine constructs with a shared lineage to the prototype automata witnessed in Chrome's retinue. The Archimagos himself would personally direct the last of these brutal actions, his form rebuilt anew and wedded with strange materials and technologies, including some novel form of armor plating capable of deflecting all but the most potent weapons. While Lucas Chrome's trap had ultimately failed to annihilate the invading Loyalist host, it is clear from the years that followed that the so-called Perditum incursion served as a pivotal moment for the Archimagos' craft. The legacy of his demon engines wrought in a trail of gore and ash across vast tracts of the galaxy. Amongst the Loyalist camp, all the operation seeded was division. The office of the Sigillite was forced to doubt its own information networks, while the Legio Custodes, already a body that stood apart from its peers, grew ever more distant. The sands of Mars were once more watered with blood, the incursion serving as a footnote among the long legacy of conflict which stained the world, one that would continue for the entire length of the Horus Heresy, as 100 battles were fought to sway the world's fate. The Warmaster's arrival. 013, Millennium 31. As it had begun, it ended in silence. Mars had long been rendered silent, blockaded by vast gunships and saturated with vox interference intended to smother the scrap code of the Dark Mechanicum, lest it affect the other worlds of Sol. Yet this silence was a comfort to Dorn as he strove to prepare Terra for Horus's now inevitable invasion. In those grim years after the failure of the Beta Garman campaign, the fall of Lorin Alpha and the burning of Vanaheim, Horus waited on the very doorstep of Sol, waiting for a chink in its armor so that he might come forth to meet his father one last time. Mars could be that chink, the flaw in Dorn's plans, and the one point the Seneschal of Terra could neither bend to his will nor obliterate. Yet while it remained silent and quiescent, it posed no threat to his defences, and Dorn dared not provoke the traitor Magi that lurked beneath the surface of signal interference on its surface, lest he wake a snake in the heart of his shrunken domain. No, the silence that troubled Dorn came not from Mars, but from the outermost edge of the Sol system, from the frozen, light-starved rocks of the Oort cloud, where the first layer of Sol's defences could be found. Here, where ships could most easily translate from the warp at the furthest extent of Sol's grasp, were vast shoals of servitor-slaved kill-sats and sensor beacons. These drifting automata were primed to activate upon the arrival of any ships that did not broadcast the coded Vox signals that identified Sol's defenders, waiting with deadly arrays of missiles, beam cannon, and alarm arrays to warn Dorn of Horus's arrival. Without these vital early warning systems to reveal and delay any attack, Terra was vulnerable, and this Dorn, as the Emperor's appointed Seneschal, could not abide. A price paid in blood. By the auspices of the Emperor's own auguries, the skills of Archimagos Cain, who had taken refuge on Terra after Mars's fall to war and treachery, were Dorn's fears confirmed. for a key section of the outer system defenses had fallen silent, somehow cut off from Terran control and leaving the Sol system vulnerable. From the surface of Mars, long hidden from those on Terra by a shard of scrap code interference and caustic ashen cloud, Kane detected a cyberthurgic beam of immense power, which linked the red planet and the distant control stations of the Urt cloud defenses. Such was the power of this emanation of concentrated scrap code, that only the largest mechanism might project it so far across the system. Undoubtedly, the product of years of labor by the corrupt artificers of the Mechanicum that now controlled Mars. The destruction of this device was now vital to the defense of Terra. However, such a mission was no simple matter. The vast cannon of Terran's orbital defense batteries could not be trained upon the red planet, for its orbit had carried it beyond the face of the sun and out of their reach. Moreover, the Emperor had forbidden any attempt to obliterate Mars entirely, for without the industry of Mars, the Imperium was doomed even should the Loyalists prevail in the war against Horus. With simple annihilation forbidden, it fell to the warriors of Terra to prosecute the mission with their own skill and at the cost of their own blood, a sacrifice that could ill be afforded by Terra's defenders with Horus poised at Sol's gates. Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, would bring the embattled Seneschal of Terra a grim solution. The Lord of Baal's Legion had suffered greatly in Horus Heresy, first at Cygnus and then further during the Beta Garment campaign, but now its ranks were swelled with Inductii warriors. These were true warriors of the Legiones Astartes, powerful in battle and outfitted with Mark VII armor stolen from Mars itself in the opening battles of the Horus Heresy, but lacking the irreplaceable experience of those few remaining veterans of the Great Crusade. This vital difference would prove their Achilles' heel, for Dorn required warriors of skill, but also of disposable character. He could replace Inductii with ease, but he could not replace those veteran warriors that stood at the forefront of his defenses. The blood of these new forged warriors would be expended to seal the breach in Sol's outermost defenses, and the battle-hardened veterans saved to meet Horus's inevitable assault. The Blood Angels' 94th Company would be Sanguinius's sacrifice to the merciless logic of war, carefully chosen by the Great Angel for the role. The company was led by the veteran warrior Aster Crone, who had long stood outside his master's favor, and composed almost entirely of Inductii warriors drawn from Terran recruitment camps. Among their ranks could be found only a single warrior of Baelite stock, the dreadnought-bound warrior Hamonar, a veteran of the battle for Cygnus Prime, whose company had perished to a man on that distant battlefield. Alone, Sanguinius's sons had barely enough warriors to offer a chance of success against an unknown foe, but Dorn could not afford to lose any other warriors from the host under his command. From among the hosts of the 3 legions gathered upon Terra came a slew of officers to accompany the brave few who were to be sent forth. Camber Diaz, of Dorn's own legion, offered his experience of battle on Mars, while Munokoi, of the White Scars, offered his grim skills with blade and pistol, to name but a few of those who clamored to fight. Yet Dorn would deny them all such requests. By his order, not one more living soul could be spared from the defense of Terra. A golden contingency. Yet Dorn was not the only lord of mankind on Terra, and others made plans of their own to ensure Terra was made safe. Once aloof and distant, the Legio Custodes had been remade in the fires of the Horus Heresy, and would no longer leave the safety of the Imperium to lesser warriors. They were not hindered by the politicking that harried Dorn, and paid no heed to the plans of the Space Marines or Imperial Army. They heeded only the orders of the Emperor himself, and before his descent to the lower levels of the palace, his last orders had been to ensure the safety of Sol. So, at the word of Shield Captain Sola Morve Carvus, and backed by the authority of Malcador the Sigillite, a golden cruiser was made ready. shrouded by relic technology that rendered it invisible to the auguries of Terra's defenders, and carrying a strike force of the Emperor's finest warriors, the ship slipped quietly away from Terra. It passed Mars without pause, for such work as would be done there was for simple butchers, and followed the baleful path of the cyberthurgic beam that emanated from the Red World. Past Jupiter and Saturn, where vast defense fleets hung in orbit, and distant Neptune, and into the black depths of space they passed, unchallenged and unnoticed. Past the fierce pull of Saturn's gravity well, Shield Captain Arcus initiated a precise warp jump to bring their ship to the very edge of the solar system, a trip that would have taken weeks by plasma drive. Any lesser force would not have boasted navigators skilled enough, nor crew resilient enough to survive such a maneuver, but the Legio Custodes had access to both technology and training beyond that available to any other force. The warriors of the Legio Custodes emerged from the warp at the edge of the Urt cloud, their ancient relic cruiser, the Sojourn, translated back to real space as close to the termination point of the scrap code transmissions as they could. Given the vast expanse of that black and frozen void, they might have searched for centuries and found nothing, but that dark space was not silent. The Sojourn's ancient augury scanners made plain the binaric songs of hundreds of linked automata killsats, whose code bursts could not resist the relic technology of the Emperor's Guard. Buried amidst endless scan reports and maintenance checks was other data. Some was indecipherable machine chatter, some defied logic, including reports of distant ships emitting the code signals of the First Legion. But at the center of the data web were the control signals that indicated the positions of this quadrant's command station. The Custodians set forth, following the invisible trail through the maze of frozen moons to its pitch-black heart. Here they beheld the Arca Celentia, a titanic automata construction designed to perpetually replicate standard pattern defense satellites at the very edge of the solar system, far from the eyes of any living creature. That vast iron leviathan loomed from the frozen darkness, far larger than the glittering golden spacecraft, and grasping it with dozens of manipulator arms barbed in ceramite. Cloaked in diffuse clouds of electromagnetic interference and light ablating plate, the Sojourn should have been invisible to any mere automata, but Arca Celentus pierced that ancient veil with an ease that bespoke malign influence. At such close range, the Sojourn's guns were worse than useless, for mere dozens of kilometers separated the two, and any shellfire would doom both. However, Shield Captain Arcus did not waver, and gave the order to activate the shield's teleporters, sending forth not shells, but the warriors of the Legio Custodes. Ever ready for combat, the bulk of the ship's complement, 200 gold-clad warriors, were transported deep within the Arca Celentus' bulk, and straight into a nightmare given dark and hideous form. Where the interior of the Arca Celentus should have been a tight maze of iron corridors and winding pipes, the Custodians found themselves in a fleshy gullet where machine and warped flesh had been fused. Worse yet, the lesser automata within the Arca Celentus had fallen to the same corruption, and even as they materialized, the warriors of Legio Custodes were met by grasping talons and cutting beams. Their combat engrams warped by the influence of Lucas Chrome's scrap code, the automata threw themselves at the Custodes like rabid beasts. A tide of screaming metal fell upon the loyalists, hulking Castellax crushing lesser automata in their blind fury, and Vorax cutting through their own allies to reach the invaders. Yet, for all their rage, the automata were no match for the Emperor's finest warriors. For the Custodians' golden armor was proof against the mechanism's most terrible weapons, and their blades cut through the armor of the corrupted automata with ease. Arrayed in a loose phalanx of flashing blades and lit flare of Adrathic blasts, Arcus's warriors cleared the emergent zone with contemptuous ease. 100 or more automata were sundered and broken in the first few minutes of battle. During the frenzied exchange, only a single Custodian fell. The aberrant nature of the warp station had introduced subtle errors into the otherwise flawless teleport routines of the Legio Custodes, and one custodian materialized with his legs encased in the Leviathan's wall. Yet, even in such a state, the doomed warrior hewed and cut as the soulless automata overwhelmed him, cutting down a half-dozen before they tore him limb from limb. The remaining golden champions of the Emperor fought on, their sheer skill driving back the unfeeling foe, yet the corrupted automata did not relent no matter how many were cut down. For the Arca Celentia, designed to exist perpetually in the darkness of the outer system, sent forth a tide of new creations from the tireless automated forges at its heart. Yet these new beasts of metal were a different breed, taller and more cruel than the castellax that lay broken at the custodian's feet. Born of the scrap code's infection, they burst from the fleshy walls like some kind of terrible parasite still steaming from the forge's fires. Their weapons were limed with balefire, and their cannons spat screaming flames that melted even the golden armor of the Custodes. And for the first time, the Emperor's Guard faced a real test. Where other warriors might have fallen back to regroup, the Legio Custodes charged, guardian spears raised and battle cries ringing forth. The Red World. Even as the Custodians fought for their lives in the dark depths of the Sol system, the Blood Angels of the 94th Company assembled upon the vast expanse of the Lionsgate spaceport. Yet, where they should have found landing pads empty, save for their own few Thunderhawk landing craft, they were greeted by the thunder of metal on metal as a full host of combat automata made ready for war. The banner of the Capita Aquila flew above them, a cohort of the famed Legio Cybernetica, and an emblem long familiar to Aster Crone, yet their presence was apparently in defiance of Rogal Dorn's orders. Aster Crone was met by Fabricator Locum Kane himself, one of the few on Terra whose influence matched that of Dorn, the master of those amongst the Mechanicum that had remained loyal to their Emperor. Kane spoke only briefly with Praetor Crone, and offered only a few words of wisdom. Lord Dorn has decreed that no soul shall leave the defense of Terra in aid of your mission. Fortunately, I have many warriors that are unburdened by such inconveniences, and have been prevailed upon to lend them to your cause. With that, Kane left without fanfare or salute, leaving the automata cohort and its master in Crone's command. At the end of the Capita Aquila was Archmagos Domina Erana Shural, who had once fought alongside the Blood Angels on Cygnus Prime's blighted surface. Her ruined body had been rebuilt with augmetics since that battle, so that now she stood on 4 powerful legs, taller even than a space marine. No doubt it was she that had convinced Kane to risk Dorn's ire to aid the Blood Angels, though she made no outward show of emotion, as was the way of the Tech Priests of Mars. Combined, the Blood Angels and Legio Cybernetica were a formidable, if limited, combat force. The hypno-indoctrinated inductii and programmed automata were alike in both the rote nature of their training and the brute force of their forms. Formidable on the battlefield, but reliant on the skill of their leaders. The more experienced warriors, veterans of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy alike, had been ordered to remain on Terra, and it would be untested recruits and fresh-forged machines that would take the war back to Mars. They tarried no more on Terra, taking ship for Mars and crossing the gulf of space that separated the two worlds. During the long years of the rebellion, Mars had withdrawn upon itself, cloaking its face in scrap code and ashen storm. Its orbital defenses lay ruined and silent, and no ship rose to defend its skies. Though Dorn would risk only a few small craft to approach the Red World, lest he awaken the fallen Magos to open war, the Loyalists deployed in haste, dropships plunging into the storms that encircled Mars, only to find that they had been expected. Mars was far from undefended. Scrap code latched invisible claws into the systems of the dropships, obscuring their sensors and blocking Vox channels. Lucas Crom and other traitor magi had not been idle, and had refined the scrap code into a deadly weapon that tore through the logic engines of Imperial war machines with a cruel intelligence, rendering them all but inert. In desperation, the pilots crashed their craft in the empty Martian deserts, some distance from the origin point of Lucas Chrome's hidden scrap code projector. There they found the surface of Mars had changed, most of its surface cities in ruins, and the marks of war and destruction everywhere. Even as the survivors of the crash, automata and inductii alike, struggled to free themselves and gather what supplies they could, they came under attack. Swarming from the refuge of ruined habs and erupting from beneath rust-red sands, a tide of horribly augmented machines fell upon them. Driven by combat engrams and indoctrinated tactics, the Space Marines and automata formed ranks and gave fire without hesitation, blasting apart the first of the enemy to reach them. More followed, each host of disfigured war engines subtly different in form from the last, and each as hostile to the other beast automata as they were to the Loyalists. The multi-legged and clawed engines soon covered the plains of Mars, a seething melee of churning metal ruled only by a hatred that drove them into the guns of the invaders or the claws of their brethren without heed for their own survival. Despite the sheer numbers of foes that sought to overwhelm them, the Loyalist line held. The guns of Astrocrone's newly inducted warriors blasted apart the foe, while the inviolate metal shells of the Capita Aquila's castellax shielded them from the corrupted automata's claws. Archmagus Shural's indomitable will held the cortex of her servants from the full effect of the scrap code, but even her arts could not fully shield the automata under her command. The metal warriors of the Capita Aquila became more willfully cruel as the battle progressed, pinning blood slaughterers in place by tearing off their limbs so the inductii could finish them, or surging forward to engage the enemy at point-blank range and threatening the integrity of the Royalist formation. The Space Marines were equally affected, plagued by equipment malfunctions as they fought the first real battle of their lives. New forged bolters catastrophically misfired, leaving numerous warriors maimed or without weapons to fight, while others struggled with communication and targeting errors that saw them directing fire onto friendly targets rather than the foe. Despite this, they were holding their position, but it was plain to Praetor Crone that they could not do so indefinitely. The expenditure of munitions and lives was such that they would be rendered combat ineffective within a day and left unable to complete their mission. Faced with a choice between annihilation and defeat, Crone did not hesitate and gave the order to abandon the careful plan that had been decided on distant Terra. The stolid squares of power-armored warriors and automata dissolved, reforming from immobile defense formations based on those perfected by the Imperial Fists into something far less refined. Surging forward, the automata of the Capita Aquila loosed their newfound aggression in a brutal charge, battering aside the enemy as they advanced into the brutal mass of clawing demon engines before them. In their wake followed the Inductii, advancing in loose groups that descended upon the damaged and isolated beast automata left in their path and finished them with point-blank gunfire and blade work. No High General of the old Legiones Astartes would have condoned the attack, for it defied all military logic, and the cost they paid in lives and wrecked automata was atrocious. Yet in changing the pace of battle, Crone had opened up a path to victory, if not one to survival. Guns blazing and metal fists flying, the loose wedge of red and iron-grey punched through the hordes of enemies. Any warrior that strayed too far plucked from the ranks and torn asunder in the mass of bestial machines that surrounded them. Freed from the clutches of Crom's aberrant host, Crone's force sought to punch on to their target, but could not leave the enemy at their backs. Without the numbers to crush the endless tides of foes, or the time to reduce them by attrition, Crone faced a dire new threat. Yet the warriors he had trained had learned their bloody craft well, and a centurion in the proud Crimsomus Sanguinius' legion stepped from the ranks. Fist raised and a last salute to his commander and brothers in arms, the centurion turned and set his warriors in defensive line. 50 guns stood alone against a vast throng of foes, seeking to buy time for their brothers to escape and complete the mission. Their first battle, now to be their last. Master Crone did not look back. In more than a decade of civil war, he had seen too many last stands, too many brothers lost to Horus's madness, and instead he led those warriors that survived onwards to give meaning to the deaths of those he had left behind. The roar of bolters erupted, sudden and forlorn, as Praetor Crone and the main body of the host marched away into the Martian wastes, following the scrap code to its dark and hidden heart, unmolested by the foe. It would ring out for over an hour, slowly ebbing as munitions ran short, and finally ending. The eventual silence marking a solemn tribute to those who had died to see Terra made safe by their sacrifice. The Sojourn's end. At the frozen edge of the Sol system, a vast explosion blossomed as hundreds more warriors died in the name of Terra, though it was so distant from the light of the star that none of that world would see it. Shield Captain Arcus and his warriors still fought in the guts of the horribly changed Arca Celentia, but that vast leviathan had torn the Sojourn in two, ending the lives of its valiant crew in an instant. The influence of the scrap code beam that emanated from Mars had wholly changed the Arca Celentia, warping it almost beyond recognition, more akin now to some horrific space-bound iron crustacean than the stolid battle station it had once been. With its new warp-born power, the Sojourn had stood no chance of escape, and now it had been destroyed. The Arca Celentia began to relay the same signal that had corrupted it, seeking to turn the war satellites within range to the service of its new masters. Within the huge machine, the battle against the towering demonic automata fared little better, and far more than a single golden corpse now lay within the Arca Celentia. The Custodians had encountered these monstrosities years before on Mars, the product of the Dark Mechanicus' foul arts, and named them Decimators. These hulking automata displayed a feral cruelty that belied their appearance as simple machines, and even the formidable skills of the Emperor's own guard were put to the test by their power. Yet, what the Decimators lacked in skill, they made up for in sheer strength, with even glancing blows enough to shatter golden armor and crush limbs. Only working in groups could the Custodians overwhelm and bring down the demon war engines, slashing and cutting at exposed cables or blasting joints with short-range Adrathic weaponry. However, each decimator brought down was but one amongst a growing horde, and each warrior of the Custodes that fell was irreplaceable. Any advantage held by the Loyalists was temporary, and defeat simply a matter of time. The fighting raged throughout the fleshy innards of the warped Arca Celentia for hours. At first, the Custodians fought as one single body, Guardian spears whirling and cutting in unison, and battle lines shifting with each charge of the corrupted automata. Where one golden warrior was hard-pressed by the screaming iron behemoths, others of the Legio Custodes stepped in to slice at limb actuators that resembled bone more than steel, or to cut hydraulic pipes that leaked bloody ichor. As the press of foes grew too great to hold back, the Custodians broke formation and fell back into the labyrinth of tunnels and chambers within the Arca Celentia. Within the tunnels, the enemy could come at them only a few at a time, and the Custodian Guard were far more agile than the lumbering decimators that pursued them. Solitary golden figures lured rampaging bands of decimators into the confining passageways, fighting with an inhuman fury to hold out until their fellows could close the trap and fall upon the foe from behind. Yet the decimators were no longer simple automata, no longer limited by crafted engrams, but driven by cruel intelligence and malign powers. They burst from the very walls to ambush the custodians before they could relieve their fellows, and loosed cunningly placed bursts of vile flame to isolate individual warriors, crushing claws tearing apart those trapped. As more and more golden warriors were broken and cast aside by the decimator throng, any attempt to recapturing and cleanse the vast space station was rendered impossible. The only recourse that remained to shield Captain Arcus and their warriors was the destruction of the Arca Celentia and themselves along with it. Every moment that passed saw the corruption take a deeper hold, and the scrap code spread across the defense networks of the outer system. Yet perhaps the destruction of the Arca Celentia would halt or even reverse the affliction. Without hesitation, even though there would be no escape for them, with the Sojourn destroyed, Shield Captain Arcus gave orders for one last charge, hoping to pierce through to the very heart of the huge space station. Yet, only a few dozen warriors could be reached. The strange corruption that had seized the Arca Celentia, refracting and distorting Vox communications. Voices from the past emerged to remind the Shield Captain of the many losses the Imperium had endured. The Jovian Grenadiers at Mondus Gamma, thrown back in disarray. The Salamanders on Irisi, desperate to save the burning cities, and even voices from some unknown future, calling in the ciphered codes of the Dark Angels. Tormented by the defeats of past and future alike, Solar Arcus and the few remaining golden warriors of Legio Custodes pressed onwards, determined to gain a victory for the Imperium that no other warriors could win. The scrap code summons. On distant Mars, Aster Crone was no less tormented, for despite the sacrifice of so many brave warriors, his columns had made scant progress before the enemy had returned to harry them. The ruined and broken surface of Mars fought them as keenly as the beast automata that howled and bayed on their trail, its very substance sapping their strength and slowing their advance to a crawl. Now they were slowed further as bands of ragged automata they had come to call blood slaughterers fell upon the rearmost units, forcing them into short, vicious battles that expended their limited ammunitions and bled their ranks by 1 or 2 warriors in each onslaught. Were he to order a halt, they could scatter those foes that plagued them, but to do so would only allow the main host to draw closer and leave them further from their objective. And so, the Blood Angels and their iron cohorts pressed onwards. The scrap code was their beacon and their curse, for it showed them the path to Lucas Crom, but it was this beacon that drew the foe to them. It had grown in strength since it had been released during the opening hours of the Horus Heresy, and now almost all the Vox channels and cogitated networks of the Red Planet resonated to its insane cadence. Even the metal warriors of the Capita Aquila suffered under its lash, their systems slowly degrading the longer they were exposed, and malfunctions becoming more common as they trudged onwards. Yet it had not subsumed all of Mars within its maddening gyres, and Archmagos Shural discerned a subtle pattern within the howling of the scrap code on the ancient channels used by the Skitarii pilgrim hosts. The source of these signals sat directly along their path, and the Imperial forces were not the only force to have detected it. A new host of beast automata had come haunting the elusive cipher, these no ragged band of cast-off experiments, but the latest and most powerful of Lucas Crom's creations. Though blood slaughterers showed no sign that they sought the Loyalist column, they stood between Praetor Crone and his objective, and the order was passed to form fighting ranks. There would be no more running. The Inductii, now bloodied in open combat, surged forward in a fighting wedge, their flanks warded by the scrap code-racked castellax of the Capita Aquila. An open dust bowl waited amid the ruins, almost as though carved out of the rubble to tempt any passing force to set their ranks there, and the Blood Angels Inductii did not wait for orders before doing so. Even as their lines readied, the foes streamed forth from the ruins opposite, heedless of the torrent of bolt fire unleashed by the Space Marines, and uncaring of those of their bestial kin cut down by well-placed shots. This was not vainglory or blind rage, but a confidence born of numbers. For the blood slaughterers came on like a tide of metal claws, new scuttling metal beasts emerging from the ruins, even as the front of their charge neared the Blood Angels' lines. The newly blooded warriors of the Inductii did not waver, even as the holes cut in the enemy's ranks by their volleys were filled by yet more foes, nor even as the dust bowl filled with clawed metal constructs many times their own number. At the last moment, a new order rang out down the lines. Bolt guns were stowed in a single practiced movement and chain swords drawn, the roar of motors almost equal to the thunder of metal talons on the red Martian dirt. Moments before the tide of iron grey enveloped the ranks of crimson, a new sound joined the cacophony of battle. The screech of exotic energy weapons tore through the tumult. Searing blasts and crawling arcs of light erupted from concealed positions within the ruins, overlooking the dust flats and raking the beast automata. Binaric chatter on open vox lines marked the new arrivals, and their hatred for Chrome's automata signaled their loyalty. These were the Skitarii, bound not to the whims of any Magos, but to the machine cult itself. Their trap sprung by an unexpected ally, the Skitarii unleashed their fury into the traitor host that had stolen and ruined their world. They reaped a fulsome toll of the foe, for long years of resistance had taught them where best to place their shots to destroy Lucas Chrome's machines. The beast's charge faltered under the expert marksmanship of the Skitarii, and from the ranks of the Blood Angels rose the battle cries of terror as they surged forth in a charge of their own. The automata to the rear now bore the brunt of the Skitarii energy beams, while those in the front ranks fell under the chain swords of the Inductii. A cloud of red dust visible for kilometers around rose as the two forces met in close quarters, obscuring the Blood Angel's advance and causing Aster Crone to hold back his reserves and the malfunctioned plagued automata. Long experience of battle across the galaxy had granted him a keen sense for danger, and the rising cloud was a signal to any force in the area that battle had been joined. His fears were realized when the distant blare of discordant horns set his teeth on edge, and looming from the distant gloom and ash came a truly massive form. The greatest of all the Mechanicum's weapons of war, a battle titan, fully armed and far beyond the capabilities of either Inductii or Castellax to repulse. There was worse yet, for its very appearance hurt the eyes, its once glorious form marred by strange growth and indistinct icons of huge size carved into its armor. A slaughter king that had wandered the red waste for a decade, drunk on the murder of Mars's people and the destruction of its cities, corrupted by scrap code and endless bloodshed. Striding towards the swirling melee, the unnamed titan opened fire, and huge explosions rent the battlefield. Red armored corpses and shattered automata alike flew through the air, each blast claiming dozens of lives without regard for which banner they fought under. Aster Crone tried in vain to signal a retreat, but his warriors were too inexperienced to fall back from combat now that it had been joined. Archmagos Shural marshalled the few Thanatar still untouched by the scrap code's infection amongst the Capita Aquilae, yet even these giant siege automata were as toys before the might of an angry titan. Their plasma cannons little threat to such a war engine. More explosions blossomed across the dust bowl, the sounds of the impacts deafening, and the shower of red dirt that fountained up in their wake, leaving the survivors to grapple and stab in dim red haze. A third of his force now failed to respond to any signals, and the last of his reserves waited only for the order to attack, even though all present knew that they could neither escape nor defeat even a single titan. His only regret that they could not complete their mission. Aster Crone rose to give his last order, and the whole world turned white. Hidden under rubble a kilometre distant, an Ordinatus gun platform crewed by loyalist Skitarii opened fire. The blinding beam of energy it emitted struck the Titan's shield as it reached the edge of the battlefield and staggered the huge engine. It was wounded, but not mortally, and its guns turned from the Space Marines and automata at its feet towards a distant Ordinatus, its hiding place revealed. A burst of harsh binaric code screamed across the loyalist Vox channels, but its meaning was lost to the Space Marines until Archmagos Shural's augmented voice carried out in plain Gothic. "Distract it!" Thanatar belched forth plasma, and a few warriors amongst the Blood Angels' ranks opened fire with las cannon, crack missile, and plasma blasts. And though they caused no real damage, they drew the Titan's attention for a few moments. Even as its guns aligned on Astocrone's command post, a second beam erupted from the Ordinatus, this time striking the Titan's head. With a discordant scream that sent even battle-hardened Space Marines reeling, the unknown Titan fell, dropping to its knees with an impact that shook the battlefield and toppled face first into the Dust Bowl. Its final impact marked the end of the battle, with Krone's aberrant host fleeing at the sight of the Titan's collapse. Yet there was little celebration amongst the loyalist ranks, for too many of their brothers had died fighting the automata, and more still were now crushed beneath the wreckage of the Titan. Skitarii did not stop to greet their erstwhile allies. Long years of solitary resistance had left them pragmatic, and they paused only long enough to loot the dead and recover their now revealed Ordinatus, before disappearing into the red wastes to continue their battle. They granted Astocrone only a single reward for the valor of his warriors, a code fix on the frequency of scrap code that would lead them directly to Lucas Crom, and a warning that any assault on him was doomed to failure. The Skitarii's departure proved wise, for even as the Space Marines delayed to honor the dead and collect their wounded, the automata horde that had previously escaped drew close upon their heels. Now on the threshold of victory, they were again denied, for they could not make any assault with a host of the foe waiting in the rear. They would have to either flee into the wastes in the hope of evading them, or scatter them in battle and risk attracting yet more enemies, though either choice would likely be the end of their mission. Archmagus Shural gave Crone his answer, for her automata could not travel much further, riven as they were by the deleterious effects of the scrap code. Once before, Astocrone had carried her from the jaws of death. Now that debt would be repaid. The Captain Aquilae staggered into ranks, their engrams degraded by the constant influence of the scrap code, and their cohorts thinned by the fighting that had befallen the task force. The ancient banners of the Legio Cybernetica were raised high above them, for they would hide no longer, and they took up position around the fallen Titan, its corpse now their stronghold. This small piece of Mars had been liberated from the traitors. It belonged once more to the true Mechanicum, and was a fitting place for an Archmagos Domina to die. Shural swore before the gathered ranks of the Blood Angels to hold it in the Emperor's name until they returned, no hint of emotion in her carefully modulated voice. Astocrone knew better than to remonstrate with an Archmagos of the Mechanicum, for their pride was no less than that of any Space Marine. Instead, he gathered what remained of the 94th Company and marched onwards. Once more the Blood Angels marched to the beat of distant guns, as another ally was sacrificed on the altar of victory. The roar of their guns would resound across the wastes of Mars, each thunderous volley a mark of honor, and each blast that lit the horizon a salute to their valor. Denied a place in the line of glory, each of the newly blooded inductii warriors brooded on the nature of war that the Mars campaign had revealed to them. It was not the triumphant march that the hypno-indoctrination courses had fed to them, not as the memories of past veterans whispered to them in their dreams. It was instead a bitter thing of sacrifice and loss, of wasted lives and broken worlds without meaning. Yet still they marched, not because they had surrendered to apathy or bloodlust, but because in victory there was still hope of something grander. Dawn broke the monotonous horizon of the Martian wastes after an interminable and restless night. The last rumblings of Shao's sacrifice still sounded far behind the Blood Angel column as it trudged onwards, yet before them rose a new terror. They had found Lucas Crom's stronghold, the origin of his scrap code bursts, and the breeding pit of his beast automata. Vast multi-legged walkers that rivaled the largest super tanks awaited them, their backs studded with arcane sigil emitters that dwarfed any cannon the Loyalists possessed. And at their feet was a vast horde of blood slaughterers and creations even more deadly. These mobile behemoths, amongst the largest automata ever created, were the target of their wrath, yet they seemed far beyond anything the task force was equipped to defeat. Now but a few hundred Crimson warriors, the Blood Angels stood against a sea of new-forged automata horrors amidst which strode giants. Recalling the sacrifice of fallen brothers and allies, Aster Crone gave only one order to the warriors he had trained and led. They had proven themselves the equal of their forebears in honor and skill at arms, and none hesitated when they heard the call, for they would stand aside no more. The sacrifice would be theirs alone, for the fallen, for Sanguinius, and for the Emperor. Charge! The Heart of Darkness. Far from the blood-soaked wastes of Mars, all that waited for the Legio Custodes at the heart of the Arca Celentia was horror. Here the scrap code infection had wrought a more complete transformation than anywhere else. Iron and steel all but entirely subsumed by demonic flesh and rancid stench that caused even the custodians to wrench. The corrupted automata they faced were as debased as any foe fought by Crone's warriors on Mars. Ichor spurting cannon and bone claws replacing the artifice of the mechanicum that had once adorned them, spewed forth from the automata forges that the golden warriors of the Emperor now besieged. These new-born abominations were urged into combat but half-formed, barely recognizable as decimators or any other creation of the Martian forges. Mewling hatred and spite, the final wave of corrupted automata crawled forth to fight. They sought to swamp the invaders with sheer numbers and the febrile powers of the warp that the scrap code had summoned forth. This dark strength was matched against the gene craft of the Emperor's masterpiece, the Legio Custodes, and found wanting. Guardian blades spinning in a lethal coordinated pattern, the surviving custodians carved a path through the horde, led by Solar Arcus, whose paired meridian blades wrought a deadly vengeance on the foe. The skeletal half-formed automata were cut down in droves, and the warriors of the Legio Custodes beheld the corrupt heart of the Arca Celentia. It was a cage of iron, within which raged an atomantic fire. The furnace fed both the vast station and the forges that birthed the befouled automata. So immense was that heart, corrupted now by the scrap code's sibilant whispers, that no single blade could pierce it. Fortunately, the golden-clad custodians bore not only the benefice of Terra's laboratories, but also its armories. Solar Arcus and the elite Heteron turned to hold back the foe, while their fellows brought forth melter bombs to breach the heart's mutated hide. Wise beyond simple carnage, the custodians quickly divined the optimal pattern in which to set the charges, and set to attaching them to the writhing warp flesh that had covered the station's heart. Arcus and the Heteron brought time with their blood, a score against a horde beyond easy estimation. By the time the charges were set, there were none of their company without a wound, and a dozen golden warriors lay still and lifeless, their corpses rent and torn by claws, part bone and part iron. Moving as a single body, their discipline flawless, the custodians activated the melter bombs even as they returned to the fight. Blades flashing, the surviving golden warriors cut through the horde severing metal limbs from chassis and shattering fragile ocular lenses, seeking to escape the doom that they had wrought upon the Arca Celentia. At their entry portal they paused, as the melter bombs erupted in searing white and tore apart the atomantic crucible that was the station's heart, but it did not die. Almost as though the explosion had released it, the warp energy loosed by the scrap code's insidious whispers burst free. The putrid energy coalesced to form a new heart, one entirely corrupted by the power of the warp, and which was capable of spreading the scrap code's poisonous message throughout the station and killsats of the outer system. Worse yet, it vomited forth a swarm of creatures born of the immaterium. True demons rather than merely the baleful essences that had previously possessed the automata aboard the station, beset now by a throng of horned, crimson-skinned abominations, while the station's halls still heaved with decimators, and with no remaining means to destroy the station. The warriors of the Legio Custodes faced a foe unknown to them: defeat. Yet Shield Captain Arcus would no more surrender to this ephemeral foe than any flesh-and-blood enemy. Where lesser warriors might have given in to despair, the Custodians prepared for one last futile charge, a bloody death far better in their eyes than admitting failure. Even as the few remaining golden warriors formed ranks, a pitifully small wedge against a host of foes gathered against them, their Vox network spoke. Silenced by the scrap code and the death of the Sojourn, few had expected it to speak again, but now it chattered in the distinct battle code of the First Legion. So impossible was their presence that the warriors of the Legio Custodes thought this some ghost signal or a trick of the scrap code, but sensor buoys dropped by the Sojourn before its demise confirmed the transmission. Somewhere in the icy blackness of the void, far from the light of Sol where no ship should be, two destroyers of the Dark Angel's fleet clawed open the fabric of space and burst from the immaterium. Drawn by the flare of the Arca Celentia's rebirth and ready for battle in the Emperor's name, the killsats and defense stations, now under the thrall of the scrap code-possessed Arca Celentia, turned to track the new arrivals. The last remnants of the Legio Custodes task force charged. No order needed to be given, for each warrior knew their duty and the price it now demanded. Shield Captain Arcus activated their personal locator beacon and loosed a short Vox message to the ships: target this signal and fire all weapons. A thin sliver of gold met the onrushing horde of crimson and was enveloped. All but disappearing from sight, such was the press of the enemy's numbers, their battle marked only by the flash of power shields and spatter of otherworldly ichor as they fought their last battle. Their victory now was measured in blood, their own and that of their foes, for while it continued to flow in battle, the locator would continue its call. All that remained was to fight until that call was answered. Out in the silent void, the Dark Angels fought their own battle, closing at flank speed as the surrounding killsats began to loose servitor-guided torpedoes and macro-cannon blasts that flared and buckled their shields. Their own cannon batteries replied in kind, each hit obliterating the smaller unshielded defense stations, but barely making a dent in the swarm that encircled them. And those shells that struck the Arca Celentias doing little but angering the possessed station. A Phosphex warhead, guided by inexorable automated engrams, slipped past the shields of the lead ship, impacting its thruster assembly and sending it spinning out of control towards Arca Celentia. The warped and mutated station stretched forth a single vast claw of iron and bone, impaling the stricken vessel before tearing it apart in a shower of debris. Yet, even as a new iron-fanged maw ripped open the fleshy hull of the station to silently roar its victory, the second ebon-hulled destroyer darted into point-blank range and loosed a salvo of its own torpedoes into the behemoth's flank where the pulse of the Custodian's beacon was strongest. Rad warheads impacted in a flurry of actinic explosions, shredding warp-born flesh and ceramite armor alike with their fury. The side of the Arca Celentia rippled and buckled, spewing forth a stream of foul effluent, crimson monsters and broken automata. The entire station convulsed as the destruction began to envelop its dark heart. The surviving destroyer, damaged and burning, pulled up and skimmed the surface of the dying demon station as its underside shimmered in the telltale aura of an emergency teleport burst. Straining its engines until they flared and died, the surviving destroyer pulled away. Behind it, the Arca Celentia buckled and burst, devoured from within, as the warp rupture at its center destabilized and consumed it in flickering crimson flame. With the death of the huge, flesh-shrouded station, the scrap code transmission was abruptly cut off as etheric feedback flowed back towards distant Mars, and the various defense substations reverted to emergency protocols. The Dark Angel's vessel, its engines dead and hull ruptured, was spared immediate destruction, as the defense network's reset protocols recognized it as friendly, but instead was doomed to a slower death as it drifted out from the Oort cloud with none aware of its sacrifice or its plight. The final sacrifice. Aster Crone raised his shard axe and brought it down upon yet another blood slaughterer, crushing its ceramite armor and biting deep into its metal innards. With a shrill screech that no machine should be capable of issuing, the beast automata collapsed. But 3 more scuttled forwards to take its place. At his sides, the inductii warriors of the 94th Company pressed forward only to stall against the numbers of their foe. The vast walkers that continued to beam scrap code into the sky remained outside of their reach, the few long-ranged cannon proving ineffective against their void shields, and they had had no word from Archimagos Shural and the Capita Aquila in hours. Despite all the lives and blood lost on the Red World, it seemed that victory would remain outside of their grasp. What remained of the 94th Company was arrayed in a narrow phalanx, their sole dreadnought leading the charge and the few artillery cannon they possessed in the rear. Point-blank bolter salvos and the crushing fists of Hamana reaped a toll on the foe, but they were countered by the sheer number of the enemy, which fought amongst themselves in their fury to reach the Space Marines. Scrap code hummed on all Vox channels, interfering with targets and the systems of armor and vehicles, with orders now passed only by word of mouth, and the dreadnought brother Hamana booming forth the ancient death hymns of Baal as a counter to the binaric dirge. The situation was dire indeed, but the Blood Angels had not abandoned hope of victory. Each kill placed them one step nearer their goal, and each crushed automata further drained the arsenal of the foe. Spurred on by the ceaseless song of the dreadnought Hamana and the heroic example of Praetor Crone, they pressed forward. Bolters roaring without pause, and the teeth of their chainsaws dulled by the armor of the foe. Almost as in reply to the stoic determination of the Loyalist warriors, the screen of chittering blood slaughters parted at last. Not from the fury of the Blood Angels' onslaught, but at the order of Lucas Crom, the Archmagos overseeing the battle from his vast automata walker. Through the parted horde came a new terror, a brass scorpion, all churning limbs topped by a massive tail whose point was a multi-barreled cannon of arcane make, all plated in dull brass armor. The great brass scorpion ploughed through the lesser automata, crushing and scattering the blood slaughterers in its haste to reach the Space Marines. From between the immense pincers at its fore came the thunder of a great cannon, the shell blasting a hole in the ranks of the Blood Angels, as a chattering of its tail cannon reaped yet more lives. The bolter fire of the inductii pattered from its armor like rain, unable to do more than irritate the demonic war engine. This hulking abomination, unlike anything their hypno-indoctrination had prepared them to fight. Aster Crone surged forwards, his shard axe raising sparks with each strike and his bravery steadying the line, but unable to harm the horror before him. The metal abomination snatched up the Praetor in a single brass claw, taking a cruel pleasure from crushing Crone in front of his troops, the Praetor's armor creaking and groaning as it was subjected to stress far beyond its tolerance. One pauldron shattered under the strain, and his blood soaked into the sands of Mars. But before Aster-Crone could meet his end, Brother Hamona seized the brass claw that held him. Even as he roared forth the song of the blood, Hamonar's servos sang with their own paean, pushed to the limits of their strength as he tore the brass claw from its socket. Another dreadnought, a brutish leviathan, blasted a pair of cyclonic melter lances into the face of the beast, and the huge scorpion automata writhed in its death frenzy, its flailing limbs smashing more blood angels to the ground even as it died. Red dust thrown into the sky by the brass beast's death began to settle as Aster-Crone staggered to his feet. Ribs shattered and one arm limp at his side, but the huge brass corpse stretched before him. Around the battered praetor rose a few scattered cheers, but those were soon stifled as two more brass abominations scuttled forward to guard the signal walkers. This seemed the end, for the first such beast had all but broken them. Two would be more than enough to destroy the remaining loyalists. Switching his chipped axe to his good arm, Aster-Crone ignored the pain that racked him to stand straight and tall in the face of death, as the inducti gathered close about him, waiting for the bitter order to charge and die. Even as Praetor Crone drew painful breath, the sky above opened. The dense storms that enveloped Mars's upper atmosphere in gloom, blasted aside by a stream of etheric feedback that crackled along the invisible beams of scrap code. The tendrils of energy coiled about the great signal walkers, grounding in a huge blast of etheric energy that sent the huge automata to their knees, scattered the blood slaughterers, and set the brass scorpions into a twitching dance of pain. A sudden silence descended upon the battlefield. The scrap code burnt out by feedback, and even Hamonar's ceaseless chant stilled by the fury that had descended from the heavens. Into that silence roared Aster-Crone's order, not a broken and dismal surrender to death, but a full-throated roar of resolve. Every blood angel still able to move broke into a run, sprinting into the opening in the enemy's lines as the automata reeled and flailed in agony and confusion. Severed from the controlling whispers of the scrap code, they lost all cohesion, and became easy prey for the vengeful warriors of the 94th Company. Aster-Crone, one-handed and pain-searing his mind, hauled himself up the superstructure of the nearest of the fallen signal carriers to confront Lucas Crom at last, to make the renegade Archmagos answer for all the lives lost to his madness. He found the command deck empty, save for a cadre of masterfully worked thalax upon which he sated his fury. Elsewhere, his warriors had loosed their rage upon the enemy, inflicting heavy losses upon the lesser automata, but little damage to the immense walkers that bore the scrap code emitters. Worse yet, the feedback had begun to abate, and the automata slowly came back to their senses and began to surround the few surviving crimson-armored warriors. The inductii had few weapons to pierce the armor of the titanic walkers, and now the brief chance for victory began to wane. From his position high above the waist, Aster-Crone watched as the blood angels formed small knots, fighting back to back as the automata enveloped them once more and dragged warriors from their formations to be torn apart. The battle would have ended there but for Brother Hamonar. The dreadnought had survived innumerable battlefields and had walked from even the hell of Cygnus Prime, but would preside no more over the massacre of his brethren. Tearing apart the skin of one of the Titan walkers with his armored fists, the dreadnought bared the massive plasma generator at its heart and gave one last cry in the ancient tongue of Baal before throwing his full weight into the dense armor of the generator, breaching its skin and the magnetic field beneath. The dreadnought's final sacrifice loosed a tidal wave of searing death across the battlefield, the explosion blinding onlookers for kilometers around and leaving little but wreckage and seared corpses to stand as a monument to the battle that had claimed the 94th Company. Neither of the vast signal walkers would survive, the first entirely obliterated by the detonation of its core, and the second thrown broken by the blast wave that followed, its wreckage scattered across the red wastelands of Mars. With the destruction of Chrome's scrap code emitters, the sibilant tendrils of that menace were once again limited to Mars, and in the command centers of Terra, the control signal for the outer defenses cleared. There would be no chink in Sol's armor for the Warmaster to exploit, and as his ships began to translate into the outer reaches of the system, they would fall under fire of the very defense stations that they had hoped to subvert. The sacrifices made on Mars and further afield could never prevent Horus's invasion. No force could now stop him from reaching Terra and his father, but they granted Dorn and the other defenders precious time. The final battle of the Horus Heresy, the culmination of a decade of bitter fratricidal war, had begun at last. Postscript. In the days that followed the end of the Imperium that once was, after Horus was cast down, his armies driven from Terra, and the Emperor laid to rest on his golden throne, Mars was rebuilt from the ashes of its own hubris. It was no longer the bastion of progress and science that once it had been, for its innocence had been extinguished in the blood of millions. No longer would it strive for the future, to improve the Imperium with new knowledge, for having seen what terrors might be unleashed by technology unfettered, the Imperium chained Mars, even as it rebuilt it. Now it was shackled to the past, for the golden future the Emperor had foreseen was drowned in the same lava that consumed Magma City. I am told it stands for the new order of our Imperium, for the law set in place by the Emperor. Despite its disregard for the imperial truth, it exalts the creed of the Omnissiah, the deified Emperor, as a means of control, and forgets all that was sacrificed to bring truth to the Imperium. The Martian Civil War and the Horus Heresy should have taught us to strive to be greater, but only served to make us fear the very means of our salvation. It doomed us to a future of grim darkness, where there is only war. All that befell us in the age of darkness, we could have forestalled, but we chose to look away, and in our arrogance, we brought it into being.